Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rita Peters, and I'd like to welcome you to another special edition of COS Live. In just a few moments, we are expecting a debate, a second round of debate, on our resolution in the South Carolina Senate. That's H3205 is the number of our Convention of States resolution there in South Carolina. We are not expecting a final vote today. That will likely be tomorrow. And that will not be even the final vote because even though the South Carolina House did pass our resolution last year and it was carried over into this year, a Senate committee amended the resolution to make it conform more closely to our model language. So this was a good amendment that just makes it fit more closely with the language of resolutions in the other states where we've already passed. So that means if we have a successful vote today in the South Carolina Senate, and then again tomorrow, the House will need to concur with the updated language. And we don't foresee that that will be a big problem. So, passage in the Senate by a successful vote today or tomorrow will mean we're pretty close to declaring South Carolina as our next passed state. Over 45,000 South Carolinians have signed our COS petition, and a scientific survey revealed that 2/3 of South Carolina voters are in favor of an Article 5 Convention of States. South Carolina voters disapprove of the U.S. Congress by 83%, with only 10% actually approving of the job that Congress is doing. By a nearly 3-to-1 margin, South Carolina voters favor limiting federal spending, and nearly 80% of South Carolina voters favor term limits for the U.S. Congress and federal judges. And of course, these are some of the things that could be proposed as amendments under a convention called pursuant to the Convention of States resolution. The COS South Carolina volunteer team was the 2020 Team of the Year, and for good reason. They earned the official support of both the Republican Party of South Carolina and the Libertarian Party of South Carolina. They also recruited several high-profile endorsers who represent South Carolina in Washington, D.C., including Congressman Jeff Duncan, Congressman Ralph Norman, and Congressman William Timmons. Former U.S. Senator Jim DeMint of South Carolina is also an endorser. Countless letters have been sent from citizen volunteers to their legislators, and that has helped a great deal in building an impressive list of legislative co-sponsors, which we currently have in South Carolina. Last year, after passing through the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Constitutional Laws by a vote of 3-2, and then passing through the full Judiciary Committee by a vote of 14-8, the South Carolina House overwhelmingly approved our legislation by a vote of 66-42. Now, South Carolina has a 2-year session. So those victories last year meant that we wouldn't need to start over again this year to get it done in the Palmetto State. So fast forward to this year, it's 2022. A subcommittee of the South Carolina Judiciary Committee heard testimony on our resolution for about 3 hours, including from our champion, Representative Bill Taylor, who is our COS sponsor in South Carolina, COS President Mark Meckler, 14-year-old Natalie Travers, and a representative from the Libertarian Party. That subcommittee successfully removed a sunset clause, which would have put an expiration date on the legislation, and made other minor adjustments to clean up the language of the resolution so that it does conform more closely to the other 18 states that have already passed it. They then advanced it to the full committee with a positive recommendation. Last week, the Senate Judiciary Committee voted by a 14-8 margin to advance our resolution to the floor of the South Carolina Senate. If there is a successful vote in the South Carolina Senate, the resolution would then go back to the House for concurrence because the House will need to approve those adjustments made by the Senate subcommittee. So with that background, let's go now to the South Carolina Senate.
Many of you here that either work here in any capacity might remember Jake Vining. Jake Vining spent several years here with us as an undergraduate. But from the day he got here, he was telling me about VCOM, the Edwin Via College of Osteopathic Medicine. And he's still telling me, and any of you who have met him know that the man was born to be a doctor. He came out of the womb to be a doctor. He has never wavered in his advocacy and his commitment, not only to his fulfilling of his own lifelong ambition, but to any of you that had a visit today from any of the second-year students at VCOM know how committed they are, in particular, to the practice of rural medicine and holistic medicine, the well-being of the whole person. So it is very gratifying that one of our former pages and now the leader in student government and a tremendous advocate for not only VCOM but all of osteopathic medicine continues to bring to my attention the subject and impacts within their profession, and also reminds me of Osteopathic Medicine Day. So in the lobby, there are dozens of students from all across South Carolina, as well as faculty, staff, and administrators. And I'm going to let Senator Kimbrell make that introduction. But we will go outside and take some pictures with a previously adopted resolution recognizing today as Osteopathic Medicine Day. Senator?
Senator from Spartanburg.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Verdon. The Dean of the School of VCOM in Spartanburg is Dr. Matt Cannon, who's right through the glass there. And this is we've talked a lot, Senator Davis, you have Senate Bill 712 on the calendar to try and encourage rural healthcare professionals or get more doctors to go into rural environments. The #1 school in the state to do that, it's private, and it's VCOM. Spartanburg's campus is sending more people, more physicians to rural areas than virtually any other school in South Carolina, and we certainly want to give them a round of applause for that. And frankly, just for the character of the institution, and certainly Dr. Cannon, many of y'all know that my wife's family lives in Ukraine, and we were able to move some of our family out, her family out this week. And today, even though Dr. Cannon is here at the State House, my wife texted me a picture of a great bouquet of flowers in the colors of the Ukrainian flag, and she said, well, these are very sweet. I would love to have been the one who sent them, but it was Dr. Cannon there who did it. So thank you, Matt, for making VCOM look really good to my wife and making me not look quite as good. But I appreciate what you did to encourage her today. That's the kind of people VCOM represent, and let's welcome them to the South Carolina Senate today.
Welcome, and thank you. Thank you for being here today. Thank you so much. Senator from Charleston, Senator Sin.
I just have to give a quick shout out to my favorite VCOM student, my daughter, Alexa. Thank you.
Thank you. Very appropriate, yeah. Thank you all. Thank you, Senators. The reading clerk will continue to read.
The Education Committee has reported favorable on H 4944. This is a bill relating to meetings of the Coastal Carolina University Board of Trustees so as to either provide mandatory notice of board meetings must be either sent electronically or through U.S. mail to each trustee not less than 5 days before each meeting.
Placed on the calendar.
Finance Committee reports favorable with amendments on S 1106 joint resolution by Senators Peeler and Alexander. It proposes an amendment to the Constitution of South Carolina relating to the General Reserve Fund and the Capital Reserve Fund so as to increase from 5 to 7% in increments of 0.5% over 4 fiscal years the amount of state general fund revenue in the latest completed fiscal year required to be held in the General Reserve Fund.
Placed on the calendar.
Finance Committee has reported favorable with amendments on H 3346. This is a bill relating to the statutory General Reserve Fund so as to provide that the General Reserve Fund of 5% of General Fund revenues of the latest completed fiscal year must be increased each year by 0.5% of General Fund revenue of the latest completed fiscal year until it equals 7% of such revenues.
Placed on the calendar.
Education Committee has reported favorable on a statewide appointment. Member of the Governor's School for Agriculture at John Delahowe Board of Trustees, Ms. Yvonne C. Carter, Knight Carter of Moncks Corner.
Received as information.
The Family and Veteran Services Committee reported favorable statewide appointment. Member of the Board of Trustees of the Veterans Trust Fund of South Carolina at Large, Mr. Sean T. Pinkston of Charleston.
Received as information.
Family and Veterans Services Committee reported favorable statewide appointment. Member of the Board of Trustees of the Veterans Trust Fund of South Carolina at Large, Mr. Stephen L. Jones of Isle of Palms.
Received as information.
Family and Veterans Services Committee has reported favorable statewide appointment. Member of the Board of Trustees of the Veterans Trust Fund of South Carolina at Large, Major David E. Finley of Piedmont.
Received as information.
Family and Veterans Services Committee has reported favorable statewide appointment. Board of Trustees of the Veterans Trust Fund at Large, Ms. Nancy B. Dunn of Inman.
Received as information.
Family and Veterans Services Committee has reported favorable. Member of the Board of Trustees of the Veterans Trust Fund at Large, Dr. Nikki Wooten of Columbia.
Received as information. Senator from Charleston, Senator Campson, recognized and introduced the Doctor of the Day.
Thank you, Mr. President, and members of the Senate. I'd like you to join me, please, in welcoming Dr. John Corliss from Charleston, who is the Doctor of the Day. He's up in the balcony. He is a gastroenterologist, and he's president of the South Carolina Gastroenterology Association. So please welcome Dr. Corliss to the South Carolina Senate. Thank you for looking out for us.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for your service, Doctor. We appreciate it. I'm informed the desk is clear. Therefore, we're on requests for local bills. Are there any requests for local bills? Any requests for local bills? Hearing none. That takes us to special order on page 4, H 3205. Clerk will read.
Amendment number 1 has been previously proposed. It's by Senators Hutto and Sabb. It amends the bill. It strikes section 1 in its entirety.
The senator from Richland, Senator Harpootlian, retains the floor on the amendment. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. It seems like just a few hours ago we were in the same posture and same position talking about the Constitutional Convention, the resolutions, the amendments, and believe it or not, I went home last night and started reading again. I know you're sorry to hear that. But I found another sort of interesting quirk to all this, and that is that we, by this resolution, would commit, in my opinion, future legislatures, future senates, to do certain things, fund certain things, and we're not doing it specifically, but certainly if this passes and if 34 states sign on, at that point, it's going to be a requirement that we do certain things, that is the legislature. There's an interesting case Pinckney versus Peeler. The defendant's not here, but I'm sure he remembers this case. And it was about the Heritage Act, and very specifically about the Heritage Act, whether one legislature can bind a future legislature. And just to quote, as we stated, this court has not specifically addressed whether one legislature can restrict a future legislature's authority to enact, amend, or repeal. However, this issue's arisen before in 1885, and they walk through all of that. And what they basically say is, as this is not a constitutional provision, but a general law enacted by the legislature, it may be repealed, amended, there's talking about the Heritage Act, or disregarded by the legislature which enacted it. It's not binding upon a subsequent legislature, nor does a non-compliance with it impair or nullify the provisions of an act passed without the requirement. They say, for these reasons, we hold the supermajority requirement is unconstitutional. The principle we set forth in School District of Fairfield County, quote, absent a constitutional provision to the contrary, the legislature acts and conducts business through majority vote may not have been binding here because the specific issue in this case was different. But we now hold the principles of the law governs this. That is, one legislature can't bind another legislature. And isn't that what we're doing here? How is this going to get funded? I mean, we're not, in most resolutions or acts that we passed, we provide a funding mechanism. There's no funding mechanism here. How are we going to pick the delegates? There's no provision for that. So a future legislature without those specific provisions can ignore this. They don't have to do anything. Now, that may seem like I'm making a mountain out of a molehill, but it further exemplifies why this is bad legislation. When you send a group of folks somewhere, are they going to pay their own way? Are we going to pay it? How many folks are there going to be? At what point is that decided? Who decides that? Are we going to appoint a commission? Are we going to put bids out? I mean, are we going to do it like we did Santee Cooper? That worked out well. What is it how we're going to do that? And what the Pinckney case stands for is that we need to decide that now. We can't kick the can down the road. Sort of the last thing I want to say, I'm not going to go on very long. It's supposed to be other folks here that will go on longer. But the last thing I want to say is this. In my opinion, what we're doing is pandering to a group of folks who have been hell-bent to have another constitutional convention for 10 years or more. Their complaint about fiscal restraint is easily dealt with. You know, it's easily dealt with by electing people who exercise fiscal restraint. This is the cowardly way at it. If the issue is that important, and to me it is, it's important that there be fiscal restraint. And by the way, this isn't a partisan issue. The budget deficit increased as much, if not more, under Trump than it is under Biden. Ronald Reagan spent, even though he talked a good game, spent a huge amount of money on defense. Matter of fact, and I give him credit for this, he spent so much that the Soviet Union collapsed trying to keep up. So fiscal restraint is something we can deal with relatively easily. Now, I would agree with the senator from Charleston, term limits are a little tougher because people don't necessarily act against their own interests, and they do if you've been in the United States Senate for 30 years or 40 years. It's become your lifestyle. It's become the way you live. It's become you become it. And very few senators or congressmen give up the job voluntarily. So here's a novel suggestion on term limits. Beat them. If their constituents, you know, in the old days, and senators from Charleston, Mendel Rivers, Fritz Hollings, the way they got reelected was bringing the bacon home. You know, every U.S. attorney and prosecutor in the country comes to Columbia, South Carolina to be trained at the NAC, the National Advocacy Center over at USC. Fritz Hollings brought that here. It cost not a lot of money at the time, $10, $20, $30 million. It's a huge economic boom for Columbia. Mendel Rivers, I don't have to tell you, Senator Davis, that what he did for Charleston and what he did for the Low Country in terms of military investment, the Naval Yard. So is that fiscal restraint? Are those good things? I mean, it's just to come up with a fiscal restraint. Now, if you want to have a budget cap of, half a GNP, or you want to tie it to some formula, there are a number of different proposals on that. That makes sense as long as you have escapes for a natural disaster or war. You have the ability to exceed that. I don't see a problem with that. I think many of us would support that. But to send a bunch of folks to a convention with the charge of fiscal restraint, I don't think that's going to be very productive. Term limits, I think a senator from Charleston said he term limited himself. That would be political suicide. Maybe we need some assisted suicides. Maybe we need to help some folks leave. And by that, not any of us necessarily, but I would suggest that if their constituents weigh the fact that they're doing something for them against whether they've been there too long or not, then they ought to go.
Senator from Fairfield, what purpose do you rise?
See if Senator yield for a few questions.
With Senator Yield for questions.
Sure.
Senator yields.
First, and thank you for your historical lessons from yesterday, as well as your humor in those lessons. Talking about the details of the process, knowing that a convention would meet, but then you'd have to have so many states ratify. Is there any comfort that 13 states could refuse to ratify and that would block it? Is that any comfort to you?
Well,
is it enough comfort?
It's some comfort. Mm-hmm. Does it give me total comfort? No. Could things happen? I mean, this country sometimes veers in a weird way. I cite to you 2016. Things went off the rails. Many of us believe. Some of you may not.
At least in Richland County, yes.
Yes. So, no, I don't take comfort in the fact that it'll take 75% to ratify. And I just don't think that, again, this is when is this going to happen? 10 years from now? 5 years from now? How long, I forget from the ERA how long this process can go forward before it's invalidated. But at some period, 20 years from now, I don't know. Again, we're kicking the can down the road.
Speaking of can kicking, term limits has been around for how long politically in terms of your career?
If you read the Madison notes, that's been around since 1784. Term limits were proposed at the Constitutional Convention in 1784. And I tell you, if there's a group that I thought would buy into it, it would be that group, and they did not.
Did you know that this body, I think it was the year before you got here, actually had a subcommittee hearing on a term limits bill, and did you know that it passed subcommittee unanimously?
How did it do on the floor?
Did you know that the time ran out that session from our ability to take it up on the floor? Which brings me to my question is, this is an attempt to try to address term limits really at the federal level, not at the state level, but right. It is, you would respect it, it is a way of tackling term limits that you might say is a way that's too far. What would be a better way to address term limits other than just people deciding not to run again?
Well, I really think that this is democracy. If the people of a state or a congressional district think there ought to be term limits, they can impose term limits.
Do they ever seem to do that with any great regularity?
I've seen it. I've seen where folks have been in a take John Spratt, a wonderful human being, a great congressman, but he was just there too long. And the people of his district decided that he'd been there long enough.
Would you agree that the people in his district changed a little bit with redistricting, and perhaps that also played a role.
Well, they changed a little bit because they decided he'd been there too long. I mean, that's the point. The point is the electorate decided they wanted somebody that hadn't been there that long.
You also mentioned spending running amok, people wanting to rein in spending, people wanting to rein in term limits. The legislators themselves, in this case D.C., is it likely that people that have power are likely to give up their power to spend money or to give up their power for term limits?
Well, I think it's as likely as this. I mean, it's pure conjecture. As is the will they get 75% in the distant future? We don't know. The quickest way to do this is if you want to limit spending, why don't we stop taking the money? We certainly didn't take it for Medicaid. We have a history here of not taking money when we don't want it. We didn't take billions of dollars of Medicaid money, so certainly know how to do it. So maybe we just don't take the money. If we feel that strongly about it, maybe we shouldn't take the money.
Thank you.
Senator from Orangeburg, Senator Hutto, what purpose do you rise?
Senator, would you yield for a couple questions?
I will.
Senator yields for questions.
Senator, do you know if you term limit the office holders, who doesn't get term limited?
Say that again.
If you term limit the office holders, who does not get term limited, do you know?
All the staff?
All the staff, all the lobbyists, all of the people who know the ins and outs of government, and they will continue on as staff always does, very knowledgeable, very competent, but can you imagine that if you had novice legislators coming in every 2 or 4 years, how much power the staff would accumulate over that time?
Well, I mean, I think that's the flip side of it is who really runs. Is it going to be the lobbyists? Is it going to be, and of course, I'm a big proponent for the elimination of lobbyists. I mean, I don't think people ought to be able to be paid to give you, I mean, I understand that you're not going to be able to outlaw it, but this symbiotic relationship between the office holder and the lobbyist or the lobbyist principal, that's where our campaigns are financed. That's who gives us the money. And so the lobbyist is merely the conduit for the message that goes along with the money. It is a system that they've restricted in Washington much more than we've restricted it here. So yeah, no, the lobbyists control the agenda now. Even without term limits, they control the agenda, but they would be far worse with term limits, yes.
But are you also aware that, particularly in Washington, the folks that work in the different agencies of the federal government, they tend to stay until they retire, do they not?
Well, I've been dealing with the Justice Department on a number of issues over the last 20 years, and what I found is this: presidents come, presidents go, those people remain. So unless there's a reach way down into the bowels of these agencies, nobody cares who the president is or who they regard those folks as temporary residents of the White House. They're not their permanent boss, and they know better because they've been doing it longer. They're professionals.
But that is not true if you get somebody who's chairman of a committee and has been chairman of a committee for several years and long enough to know who's controlling what.
Unless the lobbyists are controlling him or her.
Well, let me follow up on that for a minute. Would there be any prohibition against dark money going into the Constitutional Convention process, such that the delegates to the convention would be persuaded to change the Constitution to favor this corporation or that group? Or
both sides. I mean, it'd be the Cohn brothers, George Soros. They'd be pumping money in on both sides to skew it. And again, these delegates, I mean, again, they're not going to be us. They're not going to be professional politicians, probably. They're going to be, I don't know who the hell they're going to be.
Who are they going to be?
I don't know. I mean, but I would suggest not seasoned political operatives.
You know who they're not going to be? They're not going to be people that were elected by their own peers. They're not going to be people that got voted on.
Well, that may be, well, you know, we can correct that here by picking them by public election, by congressional district, or not statewide, I would suggest, and trying to allocate, make sure they're representative in a number of different ways. Obviously, you don't want to send the, just a set racial age group there.
Right. Maybe we could just, by default, we could send Senator Campson and you, and y'all could be our 2 delegates, and y'all could head on up there.
Do we have to bunk together?
So, but just go with that for a minute. How many delegates would each state get? Is that set anywhere?
Nope.
And so if we sent 5 delegates and California sent 400 delegates, what happens?
Nobody knows.
Right.
Well, nobody knows whether it's going to be. I mean, ultimately, at the convention in 1787, it was basically 1 vote per state. But the question is, should it be done by population, which would mean California wouldn't get 400, but they'd get multiples of what we get. If we get 1, they should get 10, 15. All those are open issues. So when I've never seen a more irresponsible piece of legislation in my very short time here because none of the details are spelled out. Go have a convention. Go do something about physical restraint. Go do something about term limits. Well, I forget what the third thing was. It was even more obscure. So, I mean, there's no.
So the number of delegates is not necessarily based on population at all.
We have no idea.
Well, do you know at the first convention, for instance, Delaware had 1% of the population, but they had 9% of the delegates.
Really?
They did. And Georgia, for instance, had 2% of the population and 7% of the delegates, which means there were some states who were upside down the other way. They had more of the population and less of the delegates.
I think Massachusetts got short-sheeted.
Massachusetts had 7% of the delegates and 10% of the population. Yeah, so they were down. South Carolina, on the other hand, we had 6% of the population and 7% of the delegates. So there wasn't really any rhyme or reason even back then as to how many delegates. It was probably whoever had a good horse and could get there, right?
Well, again, no rhyme or reason. You don't know why, and we won't know why on this one. And here we're voting to do it, to pass a resolution that would then, once 34 states pass it, then it's going to become, Congress would have to ratify it, but then we'd have a convention.
Do you think then that Congress would be the one, they would be the one who called for the convention, right?
Correct.
You think in their call they could set the number of delegates?
Article 5 doesn't indicate so.
Okay. Do you think they could set the time and place of the convention?
Article 5 doesn't indicate so.
So really just whoever got there first to the meeting place could start meeting with it. Could they do that? I mean, what if a state didn't want to send delegates? Do you have to wait on them?
These are great questions, not spelled out. We could spell it out, by the way, in this resolution. We could spell out what our conditions are, but we're not doing that. We're just going to let the good times roll.
Do you know who didn't send delegates to the first convention?
Puerto Rico?
They didn't either, but neither did Rhode Island.
Okay.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. So,
Senator from Orangeburg, Senator Stevens, what purpose do you rise?
Mr. President, would the senator yield for a couple questions?
I will.
Senator yields for a couple of questions.
Senator, do you know what James Madison wrote on November the 2nd in 1788? And if you don't know, let me tell you about it. And then I'm going to ask you, Senator, your interpretations. He wrote, having witnessed the difficulties and danger experienced by the first convention, which is assembled under every propitious circumstance, I should tremble for the result of a second. And he wrote that on November the 2nd, 1788, to Tuberville. What is your thinking
He was a very smart man. I mean, that he trembles at the thought of a second convention, having lived through the first one. I mean, when you read Madison's notes, it was chaos. It wasn't this genteel discussion of principles of federalism versus states' rights. It was a free-for-all. And the other senator.
To convene a convention of states, and it very seldom get off the ground.
That's true. The real tension on rewriting the Constitution came in 1860, when a big chunk of the country left and drafted their own Constitution and had their own Congress and had their own president. And we all know how that worked out.
And Senator, going back to a question that the senior citizen senator from Orangeburg asked, it appears as though delegates, and I asked the question on yesterday, are delegates no longer bound by the state once they get to the convention?
Clearly not. They can do whatever they want.
And they are, in a sense, under the federal guidelines?
Some question about what guidelines they're under. I mean, whatever the guideline, I mean, they probably meet and decide somehow what their guidelines are, what their rules are, who gets to vote, who doesn't get to vote, how they're going to take it up. I mean, this is a recipe for disaster, chaos.
And Senator, where does Congress come in here? Once those delegates have been selected, what is Congress' role at that point?
Other than authorizing the convention, which I think is pretty much ministerial after 34 states, so basically validating the 34 states, there's not much for them to do.
But once that convention have met and have finalized or made their amendments, who proposes those back to the state?
Well, I mean, they've got to go back and get 75% of the states to affirm. I'm not quite sure of the procedure, but I believe Congress has to ratify whatever that is. What goes back to the states has got to be uniform. It's got to be the same for every one of the states.
So Congress plays a critical part prior to going back to the states.
I'm not sure it's critical. I think it's more ministerial, but go ahead.
And they could very well not do anything, you think?
Well, I mean,
yesterday was probable.
Well, I mean, here's the problem. The problem is we in the law typically look at, oh, this problem's come up before, and a court resolved it this way. That's called precedence. Or factually, this has happened before, and this is a result. This has never happened before. We're looking at something that happened in 1784 in a totally different context of what's happening today, and so nobody knows. This is buying a pig in a poke.
Senator,
those of you from the more urban areas, not knowing what the result will be.
Senator, you know, Senator, that Senator Sam Ervin from North Carolina was a brilliant mind.
Yes, he was.
Sam Ervin, in 1972, introduced a legislation as it relates to a convention of states. And during that piece of legislation, it passed the U.S. Senate, but it didn't get any further. And there was some stipulations spelled out for the delegates, the selection process of the delegates, and the authority that the delegates would have once they get there at the convention. And if you have time, Senator, read what Mr. Irving had in that piece of legislation in 1972. He kind of blazed the path. but with caution, much caution. Do we really want to do this? Just as some of the others who have attempted and said over the years. So, Senator, with all that being said, you do agree with Madison?
100%. I've been attempting to channel Madison during this process, to espouse what Madison would espouse. Not Hamilton, Madison.
And you believe that as a state, we would do the right thing in selected delegates?
No.
And why? Can I ask why?
Because we're going to, there'll be an emphasis to select delegates who are of a, what I would consider a radical position on assembling our government. I think there's a huge danger. We don't know who they're going to be. We don't know how they're going to be picked. It may be that we chicken out and to say the governor can pick them. God knows how that would go.
And Senator, do you feel as though during turbulent times in the United States of America that we get this notion of convening a convention of the states? Have you researched that and see if there's some pattern to that?
I don't discern a pattern. I think that there's an element of our society that's dissatisfied. How many crazy emails do we get a week about government and what it should be doing and what it shouldn't be doing? When I say crazy, they're crazy to me. They may make sense to some people, but to me, they seem to be people that have, in many instances, aluminum foil on their heads, waiting for communication from an alien.
Well, considering the divisiveness that exists in this country now, do you think it would even be a good idea to even think about a convention of states?
I was reading an article the other night in a magazine about this country. People say it's more divisive now than it's ever been. That's not true. That's not true. Certainly prior to the Civil War, it was very divisive. In the late 1800s, very divisive. Prior to World War I, very divisive. During the Depression, my God, you couldn't get much more divisive. And prior to World War II, folks that wanted to get in the war, folks that wanted to stay out of the war. We've had divisive periods during this country's existence. We've survived them all. We're going to survive this one. I'm confident of that. The question is, does the Constitutional Convention help or hurt? And I think it hurts.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Mr. President.
You're welcome. Senator Newberry, what purpose do you rise?
A unanimous consent request.
State your request.
Per the senator from Richland's remarks about Hamilton and Madison, it reminded me that I had forgotten to get leave for the senator from Charleston, Senator Campson, for the balance of the day.
Without objection.
Can't hear you.
Senator from Richland, Senator Scott, what purpose do you rise?
Would the junior senator from Richland yield for a question?
It's about time for my nap, sure.
Senator yields for questions.
Senator, on a very serious note, I was trying to figure out in the conversation you and the senator from Orangeburg had as relates to the selective process for who was going to serve on this committee. And I'm looking at committee and the present structure, 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate. And I became concerned at least that it had some kind of balanced approach based on population of the state, how many congressional seats you get, and your Senate, each state gets 2. But then you open my eyes up. California, if you change the formula, California, New York, and a couple of others in Florida be telling us how to run our business in South Carolina.
They're pretty much doing that now.
I understand, but at least it's to a point that it can, that's why I know you are, that some of these things can be changed. So I want to go back to the structure. I have not heard anything about the structure. Are they looking at a system that we elect the same folk by the same structure?
Nobody knows.
And so we have a one-on-one. If you don't do, Mr. and Mrs. Congressperson, what I told you to do, then you need to go home, or you don't get to make that decision. Almost dual office holding from the same state, or are we taking in with somebody? I mean,
Nobody knows.
I'm just confused in terms of how that process.
You think you're confused? You ought to see the people that drew this up. I mean, they can't answer the question of how those delegates are going to be picked, when that's going to happen. Is it 1 per state? Is it 400 per state? Nobody knows. They're confused.
And so if you do it, when will the delegates meet?
Nobody knows.
Will it be sworn in?
Nobody knows.
And some asked to vote on something and nobody
knows. That's correct. They don't know. We don't know. Nobody knows.
So why are we spending this time when there's so many real issues that we need to be addressing?
Because I felt like speaking for a while. I decided it was time for me to get up here and speak for 4 or 5, 6 hours. It was something I've wanted to do, something I've now done. Check that off. Check that off.
So that means you go in that same box. Nobody knows.
Nobody knows.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Senator from Orangeburg, Senator Hutto, what purpose are you at?
Just before he leaves at the end of his 4 or 6 hours, I want to know if he'd yield for just 1 or 2 more questions.
Go ahead.
Senator yields for questions.
Yes. Have at it.
So, Senator, last time they sent delegates, they only sent men. Did you know that? They only sent white men.
I knew that.
Did you know they only sent rich white men?
I knew that.
Think we should do that? I mean, that turned out pretty good last time, right? I mean, should we try that again?
I'd be qualified. I can't help it. I'm sorry. And with that, no. Mr. President, that's
Thank
luckily
you.
all I have to say.
Yes, sir. The pending question is the
Mr. President.
Senator from Orangeburg. What purpose are you asked?
Are we on Amendment 1?
We are.
I'd like to be heard.
Recognized on Amendment number 1. Amendment.
I did.
Senator.
Oh, no, but he'd be, yeah, I'd be out.
Senator from Orangeburg on his amendment.
So, members, I know that some people take this as one of the most important things that we've got to talk about, and maybe it is. But there are ways that this problem can be solved without a constitutional convention. As the senator from Richland pointed out, if people don't like their current representative or their current senator, they'll get a chance every other November to make that change. We don't need to have a constitutional convention convened that could get out of control, that could start tampering with our basic rights that are guaranteed to us just because a few people are dissatisfied with their representative. Some of these very people who are dissatisfied with their representative or claim to be don't seem to be getting involved in the process, don't put their names on the ballot, probably don't campaign, and maybe don't even vote. But this seems to be a pretty drastic way to handle that. The other thing that I hear them complain about is a balanced budget. What would we do right now with a balanced budget amendment facing COVID and potentially facing, we hope not, but some sort of armed conflict in Europe, or at least the need to have to arm our allies? What if we were just out of money for the year and we had a balanced budget amendment? How would that work? Well, we don't know how it would work because we don't know who the delegates would be. We don't know what they would decide when they got there. We don't know whether they would have safety valves that would allow us to change the budget in time of conflict. But, you know, we are about to go into, I guess ironically, since we're debating this, go into the budget debate in a few weeks where we're going to be debating money that was allocated to us from Washington way over what could have possibly come to us if we'd had a balanced budget amendment. All the money that we're going to use to bring ourselves out of this COVID pandemic, to make sure that we can get back as close to normal as we were, to make sure that our school students who were behind and have gotten behind as a result of not being in the classroom, not having the teacher in front of them, we have money allocated to do just that we would never have gotten had there been a balanced budget amendment. And so I wonder if those folks who were for the balanced budget amendment, when the PPP loans came out, did they turn them down? When the money was going to every person in the $300 or the $600 or the $900, did they turn it down? I bet they did not. Yet they complain, oh, Congress is doing something I don't like. But when it benefits them, it's fine. Do these same people get their Social Security check every month and send it back? I bet they don't. You know who would be the first to complain if they didn't get their Social Security check? The very same people who are pushing for this. You think these people turn down Medicare when they get to be 65 because it's going to break the budget? They do not. It's pretty ironic and maybe pretty selfish that they say, oh, we want Congress to do this, but not if it affects me, not if it touches me, because I want my Social Security. I want my Medicare. I want my Army to be strong. I want us to be able to stand up to Russia. I want us to be able to respond to a pandemic. When my business is having to face with possibly laying off people, and the only way I'm going to be able to keep them and keep their jobs is to get a forgivable government loan. Is it possible that any of this will happen if this convention gets up there and does what they say? You know, I've got them here, and we can take them up one at a time, but what if they got up there and said, and I'm going to tie this into this amendment, which is if we're going to have new amendments, if we're going to have a Constitution that takes up new amendments, we ought to have one that takes up hate crimes. Pretty important subject. But back in the day, the First Amendment, they wanted to make sure that religion was free. There was a freedom of religion, that speech was free. You could say what you wanted to within reason, that the press, the ability to assemble, that those were freedoms that were protected. And you know, they didn't get that in the Constitution originally. They came back through an amendment process, through the normal amendment process, and did that. And quite frankly, we've had, how many now? Over 27 amendments now. It hadn't been a problem to amend the Constitution, just going through the normal process. And we know what that process is. We know how to do that. We know that it comes back to the states, and the states, if 3/4 of them ratify it, then we have an amendment. And the fact that they have not politically been able to get Amendment 28, if that's what it wants to be, a balanced budget amendment through Congress, then vote for some different people going to Congress. But why risk what rights you think might be precious? Your Second Amendment rights, your Fourth Amendment rights, your Fifth Amendment rights. I guess they're all, depending on what day of the week it is, they're all important to you because you don't know which right you're going to need to exercise until you try to exercise it. Can you imagine delegates now going from California and New York in vast quantities, more than we'd be able to send probably, and voting to renew the Second Amendment? I don't think they would. I don't think they would. And for many of us, that's a pretty important right. How about Fourth Amendment, the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure? That's a pretty important right, too. Do you think that there would be people who might say, well, you know what, that's been abused from time to time. Maybe we should change that. And here's the thing, each one of these amendments and the language of the Constitution in general, if there's been problems with how it's been interpreted or how it's been looked at, that's all been vetted through the court system ever since Marbury versus Madison. You go and have a new Constitution come out, you could be throwing all of that historical interpretation of the Constitution we've had if people tweak a word here or tweak a word there. And who would we send? Who would we send? And how many people would we send? You know, the last time South Carolina sent a few more people to the convention percentage-wise than we actually had people in the state. How many could we afford to send? And who would pay for them to go? Would it only be people that could afford themselves to travel up, to give up 3 to 5, 6 months, however long it would take to have a convention? Because you surely don't think this thing would happen in one weekend. I mean, it would take weeks and weeks, if not months and months. Who's going to pay for that? And how are we going to choose who's going to pay for that? And would people try and influence who's going by this contributions, dark money? Talking to the senator from Lexington a minute ago, we can't even control dark money in our election cycle. How would we ever control dark money at a constitutional convention? You know, I don't know anything more radical and liberal that's ever been proposed by this body than that we send unrestricted people to Washington who we didn't elect, who got appointed somehow, to just do whatever they want to do. And they could change their mind when they got up there. You know, there are people sitting here right now who told the voters they were Democrats, and when they got up here, they became Republicans. You could tell people, I'm going to the Constitutional Convention, and say, I'm all for this, but when you get up there, you're all for that. There is absolutely no control over this. And so, it's interesting, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of partisanship to this. The people that are writing me, at least over the last 2 days, I know the ones that are in my district, they call themselves Republicans, and they are telling me absolutely, do not vote for this. Do not vote for this. And they're telling me that because of the same concerns that have been raised yesterday and that I'm raising today. There are no rules. There's no control. Ultimately, I heard someone from Charleston, I think, tell me that the back-end control was it still has to come back to the states to be ratified. Well, I mean, that's the process now. If that's the process now, let's let Congress just propose another amendment. If there's such a groundswell of support for a balanced budget, then Congress can just send a balanced budget amendment out, and we can see whether 3/4 of the people will ratify it. I think before anybody ratified it, you need to be thinking about giving all that money back that got spent to help you with the pandemic. I think you need to be looking on TV right now and seeing when we've got those Javelin rockets lined up in Poland right on the border to send them over. What if all of a sudden they said, whoa, 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 we spent too much this year. Got to pull some of those back. We can't afford those, not this year. We're going to have to wait till next year. It is really, I don't know if odd is the right word or it's just strange to me that we would want to engage in a process over which we had no control, little control. And once these delegates leave the state, I assume we could lobby to have it in Charleston. That'd be a great place to have it. But I doubt it's going to be in Charleston. So wherever we're going to have to send our delegates, as soon as they leave, cross our state lines and go, they are free agents. They are free to do what they want to do.
Senator McLaren, what purpose do you rise?
I'd like to see if the senator from Orangeburg would yield for a couple of questions.
The senator yield for questions. Senator yields.
Thank you, Senator. So I am pretty sure you're more familiar with this bill than I am. Talking about term limits, does the bill say what the terms would be?
It doesn't. It would be whether the convention decided that you could serve in the Senate for 2 terms and the House for 4, or Senate for 3 and the House for 6. I don't know that we're restricting our delegates to vote for anything in particular. And look, that would never work. That's why if it's the other way around, if they wanted to have term limits, then they sent it to us from Congress and said, term limits shall be 2 terms in the U.S. Senate, 4 terms in the U.S. House, we'd know what we're voting on. We would know whether we wanted to ratify that or not. But under this process, we're sending free agents to Washington or wherever. Maybe we send them back to Philadelphia.
So,
and we wouldn't know. We don't know what terms they'd come up with.
So I was just thinking that if I'm for term limits, and I could be wrong, I was just thinking if I'm for term limits for federal officials, Congress, members of Congress, I would probably be in favor of term limits for state legislators. I could be wrong, but that's my assumption. And if my assumption is correct, it baffles me because I've looked at some of the members who sponsored this bill. You know, some of them been around as a member of the House for over 20 years. And so to me, would you agree, it's kind of hard to say I'm for term limits, but I run every 2 years and been elected, re-elected till I've served over 20 years. So that just seems like you're saying one thing and doing another, although I do realize that this is only talking about Congress. But did you know I feel like if I'm for term limits, I'm for term limits across the board.
Senator, I know that. And you know that if a sponsor of the bill is for term limits, what they can do, they can decide not to run again. They can decide, I've served 2 terms, 4 terms, 6 terms. I've decided not to run again. I'm a term limit themselves, because that's one way of doing it. The other way is that the voters just get tired of that person or find that he or she's being non-responsive to what they were elected to do, and they could oust them.
Did you know that I think that that's the best method of term limits, is that the voters have a chance to vote us in or not, or either re-elect us or not, and it's totally at their discretion. So I've always said, if you look at it that way, did you know that we already have term limits? It's just in the hands of the voters where it should be.
Right, but did you know that some people in South Carolina want to term limit a House member from California or a senator from Texas? It's always, they want to term limit somebody.
Or even in South Carolina, they want to term limit, say, for example, my congressman, but I want mine to continue to serve. And so that, again, I think is sort of hypocritical. But going back to this bill or this amendment, and I understand that the term limits is really addressing Congress. But did you know also what I find strange is just talking to some folks who are for term limits, and they're adamant we ought to have term limits, but they vote for their federal elected officials, congressmen, and senators, the same one, over and over again. They contribute to their campaigns, they work on their campaigns, and these folks keep getting reelected, but at the same time they want term limits. So I don't understand how you could want term limits and then keep wanting to send your person back to Washington every time they're up for reelection.
Senator, that's a wonderful point that you're making, because some of the people that I've talked to, because they've come up here and said, oh, we need to pass this convention of states, and you ask them, well, who's your congressman or who's your senator? And they would tell you, and they say, well, did you vote for him? Did you vote for him time before that? Did you vote for him time for it? Yeah.
Vote for them, donate, work on the campaigns.
Exercise their own control to term limit the person they seemingly are complaining about. Because don't you think that if you were for term limits, you are probably talking about your own representative?
Right.
I mean, that's who you want term limit.
But the other question I have, and this is probably my final question that I would ask, is that, I watch a lot of news, and I watch a lot of what goes on in the United States Capitol, and sometimes they get themselves in a quandary. They just debate and argue and at each other's throat until they get themselves in a bind. And I watch them, and it tends to me to look that it's embarrassing for them that they've got themselves in that position. Everybody's watching on news, but you know how they get out of it? They get out of it, from people who have been there for a long time and have a lot of knowledge, institutional knowledge, and they have a lot of experience. And so when they get into a huge bind and don't know how to maneuver out of it, it's the folks that have been there a long time because they've dealt with this over the years, and they're able to just come up with just a magical solution to whatever bind they're in. And I often said to myself now, if we didn't have these folks who have been there for a certain period of time, they'd have a mess on their hands.
Senator, do you know that's called institutional wisdom?
Yes.
It's people that have been involved for long enough to have learned the ropes, learned how to do, observed other people doing, learned the rules, know how to handle, as you say, difficult situations, times when things seem to be at just total loggerheads, and they are there to say, wait a minute, I remember a time when we did this, and we can't do exactly that, but we could do a variation of that. And could you imagine that if you had 2 or 3 people there trying to decide this who had never been involved before, how they would possibly figure that out?
It would be a mess. But did you know also, I just thought about this as I sat down, because I think whether it was NCLS or SLC, legislative conference I went to over the summer, and I was able to talk to several legislators from all walks of life, all parties, and some actually represent or serve in states that have term limits. And did you know that they told me one after the other that at about the time their term is up, that's when they just really understand what it's like to be a senator or a House member. So when they learn and they have that, I think you call it institutional wisdom, their term is up. And then, you know, somebody else brand new comes in, green, for lack of a better term, and they don't know a lot, they don't have a lot of that knowledge. And so they were just telling me how they thought it would be better to govern their state if people that had that knowledge and had that experience could stay around longer if the people wanted them to, if the people elected them for another term. But because they have term limits, a lot of knowledge and experience that would be beneficial to their state walks out the door.
And Senator, I want you to think of this in terms of being a committee chairman. In a state where you're term limited, nobody gets to be a committee chairman probably as a freshman. They get maybe their second, but maybe their third, and they get to be chairman, and all of a sudden it's over. But you know who gets to stay? Who was there before they got there and will be there when they leave? The staff. And our staff does a great job. But our staff is not elected. The folks that are hired to run our state agencies do a wonderful job. They're accountable to us. They're accountable to the people through us, but they're not directly accountable. And so look at other institutions that we respect. Look at the military. They take the guy that's fresh out of school and promote him all the way up. No, everybody has to start at the bottom and move their way up. And you may go to the officer track, you may go the enlisted track, but whichever track you're in, you start just like everybody else. And through merit, through proving that you understand, that you know you move yourself up. Business is the same way. They don't hire the new guy out of banking school to be the president of the bank. They make them almost all, make them a teller. Then they make them a loan officer. You know, then they make them a vice president. Then they make them a president. That's right. Just the way that we have determined in our country over time that we train people.
Well, did you know that, I know again that this Convention of States deals with Washington and the federal government, but did you know that also here, since I've been here 10 years or so, I've seen this body get into some quandaries and get into some messes, and it has been those members that have been here for a long time that have the experience, again, and the knowledge that helped us get out of that so we can move on and progress with whatever had us kind of, you know, at a standstill.
Well, Senator, I mean, that's a very astute observation, because that's just the way it works in life. Even if you go, you know, sometimes some of the trickiest politics, I talked to my colleague here on the front row, can be inside the church. And, you know, you don't go to the newest member, the guy who just joined the church, to ask how do you figure it out. You go to people on the deacon board. You know, you go to the board of trustees. You go to people who've been around. You've heard the expression, been around the block. Well, it's important to kind of have been around the block if you're going to ascend your way up the ladder to learn, to know. Senator, you know when you first got elected, because I know from when I did, there's a lot to learn. There's a lot to absorb. And you can't know everything when you get here. And so sometimes people say, oh, well, before you got to the Senate, did you serve in the House? Some did, some didn't. But even if you did, it's different. You could have been a mayor or a school board member, or you could have been just a Joe citizen and got elected to the Senate. No matter where you came from, there's a lot to learn. And if you think about it over time, because I've been here a while, I'll admit that, but I really didn't figure the budget out. I'm not still sure I know completely how the budget works, but I guarantee you those first 6 years I was lost. I did not know what was going on. I'd see people putting things in the budget or taking things out of the budget or moving money in the budget. I had no idea what was going on because it takes time to figure that out, and you have to watch. Study how people do it. Look at which staff members help them do what they're doing. Go talk to those people. See what the process is. Figure out the people from the outside, the agency heads and the people from the BEA who come in and they seem to have this knowledge. You have to meet those people. You have to develop relationships. You have to talk to them. If you're term limited, none of that's going to happen for the elected official. But the people you're trying to get, know, to meet, they're still going to be there. And next year, they're going to be dealing with freshmen again. Freshmen, they can run circles around for at least 4 years until they figure out what's going on. It's just no way to run a government. It's no way to run a business. It's no way to run the military. We don't do it in any other institution where we just kick people out after they finally learn their job. It doesn't make any sense.
Senator from Richland, Senator McLeod, what purpose do you rise?
Will the senator yield for a couple of quick questions?
Senator yields for questions.
Thank you. Senator, I appreciate what you are trying to do with this amendment as it relates to hate crimes. I am equally concerned about a runaway convention. And did you know that I have introduced consistently, introduced bills to bills for term limits in this General Assembly, and I've also introduced a bill that would allow us to have a biennial budget. Did you know?
I knew parts of those. I didn't know the biennial budget part, but some states, I think Texas and a few other states, do that.
Right. When I first got elected to the South Carolina House, actually, I became aware at the time of how much time we actually waste in this body and in that one. And I thought the best way for us to prepare as a state and maximize our time would be to create or to have a biennial budget. Do you believe, as I do, Senator, that charity begins at home?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so my reasons for introducing term limit bills is simple. I believe that before we do something like this and focus on the federal government, we should focus on what we're doing right here in South Carolina. And so when I discovered that there are lots of senators and House members who have been serving for a long time, I thought, hey, the best way to approach this would be to look at some of the states and talk to some of the folks who serve in states that have term limits, did you know? And so in doing that, I discovered that a term of 12 years in each body, in each chamber, has been recommended as being reasonable so that we have senators and House members with institutional knowledge, did you know? And, the complaint that I've received most often from states and colleagues in those states who have term limits is that the terms are too short. And so 24 years, do you think that a House or Senate member can really make a meaningful contribution to this state in 24 years?
Oh, I think absolutely. And I think, if you're going to have term limits, those seem to be fairly reasonable. But the flip side of that is, do you think that a member can make a meaningful contribution in their 25th year or their 26th year or their 27th year? And the answer to that is probably yes as well, if the voters back home support them in what they're doing and if they're responsible to the people back home, because I'm sure you've had people ask you from time to time, are you going to run again? And you say, oh, absolutely. They don't ask you that because they're disappointed that you're going to run again. They want to make sure that you're going to run again because they want to know that the quality of the representation that you've been providing, that you're willing to continue. Because a lot of times they ask in a spirit of sort of, I know that, you know, this can't be easy. I know you take away time from your family. I know you take away time from your business, but we really appreciate what you're doing. I hope you're going to run again. And you know what? If they don't say that and they don't agree with that, I respect that too, and they can vote for the other person. That is the ultimate term limit.
It is, Senator. And did you know that I've served 6 years in the South Carolina House and have now served 6 years in this body? And when it comes to a convention of the states, did you know? I just believe, as you do, that we need to start with us, not the federal government. And so I'm concerned that we are trying to legislate something for our congressional folks that we are not willing to do for ourselves.
And let me talk to you about that for a second. So we say, well, we do it here. We have a balanced budget. We're required to have a balanced budget. And you know what? We do balance the budget. On paper, we balance the budget. But how much federal money are we also running through our budget that's got nothing to do? Well, we're using the fact that they don't have the balanced budget to balance our budget so we can beat our chest and say, hey, we balanced our budget. Now, we used some of that COVID money y'all sent us that you couldn't have sent us if we passed this. And so we're taking credit for what we're complaining that they're doing.
Right, exactly. And to hear some of our elected officials talk about a surplus, you know, it's bothersome because we can't really say we have a balanced budget or at least not a surplus or an influx of money without recognizing the fact that that money is coming from the federal government, from the Biden administration, and we are eager to spend it and rail against it while we're spending it.
Oh, absolutely. You know, that's the irony of ironies, right? Is that how many times have people come to you and say, man, I went down to wherever, Disney World, and I got down there and the roads in Georgia and Florida, boy, they were a whole lot better than the roads in South Carolina. Or, I went to North Carolina last weekend, and did you know their highways, once I crossed that state line? Now, what that's telling me, which I know, is that we need to fix our roads. We need to do better, and we've started on that. We raised the gas tax. We've taken some of this money we've allocated in this year's budget, money to go to roads and bridges, and that's important, and that's a good thing. But if we had the balanced budget amendment, we would not have that money to spend on roads and bridges, and therefore we couldn't do the other thing that it looks like we're poised to do, which is tax relief, because we're basically giving tax relief with state dollars because Washington doesn't have a balanced budget amendment, and they're giving us that money, and we're going to use that money on roads and bridges that we probably would have had to use out of the money that the same people are saying, hey, how about some tax relief?
Right, right. Did you know that I served on the subcommittee on these bills?
I might have been aware at one time, but I didn't remember as I stand here right now.
Well, one of the questions, did you know, that I asked during those subcommittee meetings was whether we were going to hear from legal experts who could talk to us about the implications and the potential impact of doing something like this in South Carolina. And I got no real answers, and of course, we didn't have an opportunity to hear from any legal experts. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that we probably would have benefited by receiving that input, because if you think about it, and you and I have never served in Washington, and we know people who have, and it's a big government to get your hands around, but it has so many moving parts. What if let's take the military, for example. You had a balanced budget amendment, and all of a sudden there was saber rattling in China, and we got the situation in Ukraine, and we needed to get our ships out of port and get them out to sea. That we needed to get airplanes positioned globally. But we just said, well, I'll check the fuel budget at the Pentagon. We just don't have any more fuel this year. So what are we going to do? I mean, who knows whether the delegates would put in any safety valve or the correct safety valve or one that could be used in time to respond to what happened. I mean, things happen in the world, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's weather situations, whether other countries acting up in ways that we know are wrong. We've got to be able to respond. When you're the most powerful country in the world, who would want to restrict yourself from being the most powerful country in the world? I mean, why would you want to put handcuffs on yourself? It makes no sense.
It doesn't, Senator. And, you know, would you agree that we are embarking upon a really slippery slope, a very dangerous place with these bills?
There's no doubt about it. Right now, our ability to put money in the worldwide system is very important. When the stock market started going down as a result of the situation in Europe, did you hear a lot of people saying, hey, I got to run down to the bank and take out a bunch of euros, or I got to run down to the bank and I got to draw out some yen, I got to go to the bank and fill my pockets full of rubles? No, but you heard people over there saying, I got to get to the bank and get some dollars. All right? Now, if the people around the world were concerned about our ability to pay our bills whenever they come due in the future, they wouldn't be drawing out dollars, but they do, and we do. And the entire world's financial system right now is based on that. One day it might be based on Bitcoin, but right now it's based on dollars. And you start restricting the amount of dollars going into the system that can go into the system in emergency, in times of disaster, in times of war, we will be hurting ourselves in a tremendous way. And it just gets me back to, we are our own supervisors. We can decide at any time to stop spending money. The people we elect, and we have a good quality of folks that I think that we send to Congress. They go up there, and not all of them, okay, just kind of like not everybody here, but most of them are good, hardworking, honest, reliable, diligent folks who want to get in and do the right thing to serve the citizens and make the right decisions. And so each year as the budget comes up or a spending bill comes up and the Pentagon says we need this, or the Commerce Department says we need that, or the national parks say we need this, those folks in Washington get to say yes or no. And at any point in time, they could say, we really don't have the money this year. We're not going to do it this year. We might maybe do it later. And they do that sometimes. But other times they go, no, it's important now. And that's why I would tell you now, just like we're about to do in the budget that we're going to take up in a few weeks, we've got real problems with education in South Carolina because of the pandemic. I'm not saying we didn't have problems before, but as a result of the pandemic, a lot of our students got behind. Some of them got off the grid. Some of them we don't even know where they are. I mean, when you talk to people about truancy or people that aren't in school right now, we're just not sure where they are. We know where they were. That they're behind. And we need to invest in those children. And what if we didn't have this money coming from Washington to help us do the things to catch these young people up? We know we've got problems with teacher pay, teacher retention, encouraging young people to become teachers. We're going to have to incentivize them. Do you know that I saw a sign today that if you work at Chick-fil-A, I'm not talking about manage one. I'm talking about work at Chick-fil-A. you'll make more than a South Carolina starting salary as a South Carolina public school teacher?
Wow, wow. No, I haven't seen that, but I'm not surprised. And to think about what you just said about our minimally adequate public education system in this state, and to hear our elected officials talk about everything but that, and the impact that it's already having and has been having on South Carolinians. I was grateful yesterday to have been educated by my colleague, the other senator from Richland, one of the other senators from Richland, Senator Jackson, when he talked about a gentleman who served in this body that I had not heard of. And there's so much of that. I went to Mitchellville recently and learned even more. I mean, these are the things that aren't being taught in our public education system, and that too needs to change. And did you know, I think that when we talk about the money that is coming into South Carolina from the federal government, it's not a surplus, because our immediate needs are not being met. And until that happens, we can't really consider that money a surplus. But I'm all for a balanced budget, and as I said, I'm for term limits as well, because I think that it gives those of us who are working people and have not been able to serve in these spaces and a real opportunity. And it doesn't allow others who have served for a long time to be in position forever, so that we can't get new and fresh ideas from folks who are actually engaged and working and understanding and connecting with the needs of everyday South Carolinians.
I hear you on that, and I get that, and I encourage young people and older people, for that matter, to get engaged, to become active, to be involved. And not everybody gets to serve in elected political office. But if you're engaged in your community and you want to serve, there's a place for you on the library board, on the technical college board, on, the recreation commission, teaching Sunday school, coaching Little League. There's a place for public involvement for everybody. Maybe not at this level, but there are a lot of other things that make just as meaningful contributions in lives of individual people around this state. And so it's important that people get engaged. And so I think you and I are just disagreeing about the term limits, in the sense that I believe that it's hard. I mean, maybe if everybody was term limited, it'd make a difference. But what I still can't answer to myself is, the legislators can only serve 12 years, but the public employees can serve 30 years. So they're the ones that are going to know.
24 years.
24
Not
years.
12. Yeah, right.
Okay, but 24 years. It's just that it's going to be, even though you could serve 24, doesn't mean you have to serve 24.
Right.
And that's going to be fairly, we look in this body, fairly large turnover. Without term limits, we've had a pretty big turnover over the last 10 years.
Some of that was involuntarily.
Well,
but I get what you're saying.
It's still, it's who the voters selected.
Right.
And I respect
Absolutely.
that, and we have to all respect that. But if the voters get somebody that they've invested in, and they think that that person is doing what they think needs to be done, why would you not want to? It'd be like, what if we said pro quarterbacks can only be quarterbacks for 8 years, and then there's some younger talent out there. I'd love to see him on the field, and we'd never see a Tom Brady if you had to go. But my point is, in the private sector, in the military, in sports, we don't terminate people for the sake of terminating them. We let them, through their own merit and ability. If you're a ball player, you got to prove it to your coach. If you're in the military, you got to prove it to them, or they're not going to promote you. If you're working at the bank and you start off as a teller, and that's the highest you're going to go, then they'll tell you. They'll pass you over. They might not tell you directly, but you'll notice other people getting promoted, and you didn't get promoted. That's pretty much a signal that you're not ready to move up.
Senator, would you agree, though, that there are a number of other factors that impact that, like gerrymandering? And,
Oh, well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Dark money.
Yeah, and I think we are closer in terms of where we are on that. And no worries, I've been introducing those bills consistently, and they have not seen the light of day because, there's no appetite for that in here. But now there is. And so, I just wanted to kind of talk about the hypocrisy of that, because I think it's important for voters to understand that even though we are debating a constitutional convention, we have no appetite to change anything as it relates to us at the state level.
And Senator, you're right, and nor do we have any control over who would go to this convention. I am pretty sure that I could say that there would be a very low likelihood that we would send a single mom, a homeless person, a disabled veteran. I mean, they're just, and everybody deserves to be represented at a constitutional convention, but who you're basically going to end up with is sort of who we ended up with last time.
That's exactly
Old, rich,
right.
white guys is who's going to go.
Right.
And are they representative of us? I would imagine that Congress is going to be more representative than the Constitutional Convention. Because the Constitutional Convention, we don't know how these delegates are going to be picked, right?
Right.
But they're not going to be elected. I mean, they're not going to be, to our knowledge, not going to be popularly elected. And I don't know that they're going to be elected by the body. I don't know if they're going to be nominated by geographically and say, Greenville gets one, Charleston gets one. And then if that's the case, then what about the rural areas? I mean, does anybody from a small county got a shot at being a delegate to the Constitutional Convention?
Being from a rural area, yeah, I can tell you that that's not likely. And that concerns me as well. There's so much that does concern me about this bill. And, to think that we had a member of this body who lost his life the way that he did in one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, and we still don't have a hate crimes bill or law 7 years later. I really appreciate you for raising awareness about that fact and offering this amendment, because I think it gives us a real opportunity to do something about it.
Well, that's so true that what this amendment is about is to try and elevate something to the constitutional level that we've been unable to elevate even to the statutory level in this state. But 48 other states have done it. And so that might show you in and of itself that that's the kind of thing that could get ratified. That's the kind of thing that has such a broad base of support that if 48 other states have done it, then maybe it does need to, there's some things that get to be, when there are so many people that agree across the country, can we just have one group in an isolated pocket here and an isolated pocket in the mountains out west that don't agree with that? Or should that just be the law nationwide? And that's, in some cases, why we have national laws, is because they basically came through the Constitution. I mean, could you imagine if we let some states decide that we only want landowners to be voters? Well, we don't allow them to make that decision. Some legislator somewhere might decide that, but we don't allow them to decide that because the Constitution says, no, that's not how you can determine that. And so what this amendment is aimed at saying is that this has such a broad base of support. It's nonpartisan, it's non-geographical. There's nothing about it to suggest that there's anything controversial about recognizing that if you target somebody based on their race, religion, gender, other factors for a crime, and I agree, everybody agrees, all crime is bad, right? But we are trying to say as a people that if you do it for a hateful, spiteful, wrongful reason, it's even worse, right? And it needs to be, we need to say as a people, we disagree with that. We just aren't going to stand for that. elevate that to the level of it goes in the Constitution.
Right.
And so I'm hoping that by this amendment will be, if we send delegates to the Constitution Convention, that that's one of the things that we'll ask them to consider. And you know what? Even if we don't ask them to consider it, they could consider it anyway. I mean, we can't restrict them,
That's right.
but we certainly can encourage them. And this would be a way of encouraging our delegates to go up there and raise that issue, put that amendment forward. Because when they get up there, who knows what the delegates from, Montana or Arizona or Louisiana are going to put up. They may put up a lot of different amendments, and we'll have to consider those. But coming from South Carolina, we want to say this is important to us, and we want to put that forward as an amendment.
And Senator, before I take my seat, can you expound on that a little bit? Because that is certainly one of my concerns if we do this. And we have been known to enact legislation that has had a much more significant and negative impact on our state than we imagined when we were debating it. Act 388 is probably one of those pieces of legislation. I wasn't here, I wasn't serving in the House or Senate then, but can you talk about just the potential for harm that this bill can cause?
Well, that's the one thing about putting something in the Constitution. You really need to think it out over a long period of time, which the other mechanism for amending the Constitution allows you to do, because it gets debated in Congress, and they get to hear all sides, and then it goes out, and then 50 other groups debate it before they ratify it. This, we're just going to have a constitutional convention, send it forward, and then we'd have the debate. It seems like we need to have the debate first, because there are things that end up in our Constitution that we wish we could have changed. And there are other things that some of us wish were in the Constitution, this being one of them, that we haven't been able to get there yet. I mean, we have had opportunities in the recent past to change the way that the lieutenant governor is selected, and the way that the president of the Senate the lieutenant governor no longer presides here. We had to go through a constitutional process. It went to the voters, though. It went to the voters, and here's the thing: for term limits, that goes to the voters every other November. It's and the balanced budget comes up every time there's a spending bill in Congress. The folks in Congress can always say, "No, we've decided we spent too much." And if they ever did that, then we may have to rethink our balanced budget amendment, because we may not have enough money coming in to balance our budget. One thing that we pride ourselves on not being a very high-taxed state, and one of the reasons is we get a fair amount of federal dollars. There are some states that are negative in federal dollars. They pay more into the federal system than they get back. I think we're on the positive side of that. Balanced budget amendment, they may scrutinize that more and say, South Carolina, you just aren't going to get as much allocation as you've been getting. You may, there's not enough money to keep open Shaw Airfield and, Fort Jackson and Parris Island. Y'all got too many military bases there. We're going to have to cut back. I mean, if you pass a balanced budget amendment, they're going to have to cut somewhere. Are they going to close Congaree National Park? Or are they going to say that y'all got too many federal judges? Or you got to close one of your military bases? What are they going to do? Because they've got to. Or the flip side of that is, are they going to raise our income taxes to balance the budget the other way? Are we really trying to do this to make sure we get a tax increase in the future? I mean, that's the other way to balance the budget, is for them just to raise more taxes. And I don't think anybody wants that. But if we make them do it, and they're forced to either say we aren't going to be able to put the aircraft carriers out to sea, then they're going to have to raise taxes, which nobody wants.
Senator from Richland, Senator Scott, what purpose do you rise?
Would the Senator from Orangeburg yield for a few questions?
I would.
Senator yields for
Senator,
questions.
when the last time we saw a balanced budget? I saw maybe somewhere around 1997.
It was when President Clinton was president.
And so
Congress knows how to do it. They've done it.
But then shortly after 1997, we really didn't have any wars that were ongoing. And then you begin to track after 1997, when I saw a war that was going on since 1978, which was the Afghan war, that we didn't take part in it until 2001. We were looking for weapons of mass construction. And then I'm looking at another war that was ongoing since 1979 that we later began to get in that war. And then I'm looking at the Pakistani war that we got into in 2001 and again in 2003 and then the Iraqi war. So we're in the 3 wars at one time, if you roll it back. And in looking at where we were from a balanced budget, looking at the decision that Congress made, because I think you said it earlier, it is our responsibility when these outbreaks, and you use Russia as an example, to be able to provide, I don't want to put words in your mouth, funding or aid to these countries, and it's not free. And so I look at the Afghan war that we stayed in it for 20 years. Up in the Biden said, we just coming home. And we had spent anywhere from $5.8 trillion to $8 trillion just in that war alone. So given what brought about...
Can I get you to stop on that for a second?
Yeah.
Could you imagine if we had $8 trillion to invest in schools around this country, in teachers around this country, in small business assistance around this country, how much more powerful we would be if we had invested that money in ourselves? But, you know, sometimes when you're the leader of the world, when you're the leader of the free world, you have to make some decisions to do things worldwide that maybe other countries don't do, and you never could do that. You can't afford to be the leader of the free world if you got a balanced budget.
So as a gatekeeper, and my research says it's good to have some deficit. And that's what I read. Countries should really not really have a balanced budget because in terms of how the deficit we create, who in fact benefit from the deficit. And that's those units of governments and others who invest in bonds and other type of securities that we offer out there. They get a return on investment, so they actually invest them back into the government. I talked yesterday, I don't think you were here yesterday, and
I tuned in from time to time. I did see you.
I figure you didn't miss very much. And we talked about these series of funding. So my question is, if this convention is all about a balanced budget, what do we do each time Congress needs to make an immediate decision? Because you wake up and 2 airplanes have hit the Twin Towers, and you need to make a military decision right now. Do we wait until the convention meet to give us an okay? Does the convention now subsidize the Congress? I'm just trying to figure all this out.
That is a question, whether we'd have to reconvene a convention and rechange. It's a slow process, right? So if you enact a balanced budget amendment, can you undo it? Or would it have such safety valves in it that says you must balance your budget except in times of extreme need, except in times of war, except in times of pestilence? Or would it have no circumstances? It's just absolutely, if we're going to actually need to expand the military, then we're going to have to close the parks. Well, if we're going to have to up our game in the to fend off pandemic, and we got to spend money on developing a vaccine, then we're just going to have to shut down some other arm of the federal government. You can't have them going.
So when I looked at the Iraqi war from 2003 to 2011, when we came out of the war, we spent $1.9 trillion. But then there was another little small quote says, but in the end, you would have spent 2.4. So I need to convene the convention to pay for the cleanup and to get the equipment back home, to get my guys home. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out how I make immediate decisions without having a convention, things that are unknown, the unknown, because you don't ever know when you go into war how much it's going to cost. You don't. And I hope we don't get into another major war ending with Russia, because it could be 30 years, it could be a 2-day. And so those kinds of things.
But when you talk about war, because we had the opportunity to hear from the commander of the American Legion today, and he shared with us a very important data point, which is that since 2000, over 100,000 veterans have taken their own lives. So that is an outgrowth of war that's ongoing, even though we may not be in war, because we owe it to those folks who served, who we asked to serve, who volunteered to serve, who showed up to serve. We owe it to them to take care of them if they've developed issues related to their service in the war. And so the war might not be going on, but we still got follow-up expenses. Right. Are we going to say, sorry, we had to balance the budget this year, so we got no mental health counseling. We're going to close down the VA homes. We just really don't have the money this year.
Well, you know, we're still paying for the Vietnam War.
Oh, right.
When you get to, which was the next sector,
we still have troops stationed in Europe because of World War II. We got troops stationed in Korea because of the conflict in Korea. So it's almost like we don't ever get out of one. The financial obligation long extends past the time that people would say that the war ended.
I want to talk about another war, a health care war, a virus war, COVID, the unknown that just appeared between changing of one administration to the other administration. So do we convene the convention twice? Because one administration treated it one way and another administration treats it another way, while the people in America just continue to lose their lives because we didn't know how to deal with it and because scientists had not come up with a vaccine to deal with the virus?
Well, no, but you raise an interesting question in a roundabout way, which is, what if 4 or 5, maybe 10 states wanted to do the balanced budget before the pandemic hit? But now that the pandemic's hit and they saw how important it was to have that flexibility because they saw the benefit of the loans to small businesses. They saw the benefit of the money that was going to people to help them pay with rent assistance. They saw the money that was going in to develop the vaccine. What if those legislators in those states have now changed their minds and said, you know, I don't know about this whole convention of states thing. I don't know about this balanced budget, because if we'd have had a balanced budget when COVID hit, we never could have fast-tracked the vaccine. We never could have responded in the way we did.
How long do you think it's going to take, given the group that size? I understand like this, the other senator from Richland couldn't tell me how the selection process was going to work, how many folk was going to be there, and how many folk I'm going to have to convince it's time to have a convention, simply because I don't believe that COVID actually exists.
Well, that's another interesting question, but do you think we'd have a screening process like we do for some of our appointees? You think we'd have a constitutional convention delegate screening process where we'd do background checks on them and bring them in front of the legislature and question them and find out?
Who's going to screen them?
Well, that's sort of the point.
Maybe we'll send them to Congress, and Congress will screen them, and then they come back and make a decision that Congress, should.
But when you say send them to Congress, Congress is there. If Congress wants to balance the budget tomorrow, they can balance the budget tomorrow. But they're going to have to either raise taxes or make some cuts that are going to be very unpopular, both ways. If you cut some things, people are not going to be happy. If you raise taxes, people are not going to be happy. So, you know, sometimes I hear people here say, well, let's cut taxes because then we'll reinvest and we'll grow. Well, that's sort of the same principle that in Congress, when they said, let's send that money down to the hospitals and to the businesses during the pandemic, because we'll make sure they survive. Right. So when we get out of this, they can grow.
Well, and just in looking at trying to make sure through all of this, we didn't go into a recession, and that's always a major issue coming out of wars, and also coming out the kind of national situation we saw with COVID. And in order to do that, we saw a lot of things happen. We saw interest rates decrease to try to maintain some stability. We saw rent checks come out, and I kind of like what you said earlier. They just came home. Yes, make these changes, but make sure my check is in the box.
That's right.
So your check can't be in the box because in order to be able to make sure your Social Security checks in the box, it's a trust fund. The trust fund doesn't have enough money to pay it, so you have to depend upon them creating it when we create the budget to make sure. If you look at the spread in terms of what the income is, $4 trillion coming in, you're spending out $7 trillion and trying to hope that you don't fully fund these trust funds all at one time. There's obligations, but it has not yet been spent. So how do you balance the budget when you have not fully funded those things that have to be funded, like Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, because those are trust funds, even the Postal Service? So how do you do it? We know what the obligations are, but you don't just do a budget and put the money in there, because you don't take in that kind of money to do it.
Well, not under the current system, and that's the point. If you had a balanced budget amendment, you're going to change a lot of the way we operate. And some people might say, oh, well, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to do that. But they're not trying to do it by saying we should move Social Security eligibility up to 70, or we should, limit Medicare, and you can only get a certain amount in a lifetime, and then you have to buy private insurance. Nobody's saying those kind of things, but those are the types of conversations they'd have to have if they're going to balance the budget. They're either going to have to raise the rates or restrict the payout. There's no other way around it, right? And I bet you that the people who are advocating for this, if you told them, okay, well, we've decided here's what we're going to do, and it was something that affected them, they'd be, oh no.
Let's talk about Congress when they try to do that in terms of moving the age up or moving the amount of money people paid into that system. We went from 80,000, getting a max about 1,800. When they moved the numbers up, they also moved the benefits up. And so did they really accomplish a whole lot doing that movement? You got to understand, people are not going to, in Congress, like this body, allow you to penalize other folk and there's no return on investments. And so these are business people too, and they're protecting also the benefits. If I'm going to pay more, that means I invested more into that fund, and it's only fair for me to get it out. So there are some things that they can do, but the problem is those back at home, when I start telling you I'm on a tax, I think it's up to $134,000 a year. I think that's the max, and it may be a little higher now. But you're going to only still get that same $1,800 a month. Some of these things people have to be realistic about when Congress make these decisions. Did it make good sense to the basic citizen of America? And if it does not, then you're going to get term limits. Whether you've been there 2 years or you've been there 6, you're going to be home. And so you've got to come back home when you make these decisions and sell it back to the people of these states. So how does the convention come back? I balance your budget, but I cost you more on your benefit side. I balance the trust fund as it relates to Medicare, but it costs you a lot more. And we've already been through that process when we streamlined and created plans under Medicare. I balanced your budget on the Medicaid, but you got a lot less benefit, and those who qualify for it are sicker than it was before, so I put more strain back on the hospital system. And so there's some common sense to it, and that's why these folk, before they make these decisions, they have people who go on fact-finding missions, who collect data for years and years, and come up with something that makes sense. I'm going to go back to the convention. Who collects the data to make sense? Since I'm going to have a balanced budget, I'm going to get involved in making policy and making major changes that affect millions of people in America. And then you're investing now as you get your paycheck, or when the time comes, you can get your benefits.
Well, the answer goes back a little bit to what the other senator from Richland was just talking about, is that she served on the subcommittee and asked about the possibility of having some experts come and testify. and testify maybe to what would a balanced budget look like at the federal level. Before we go calling for one, what are we talking about? Are we talking about reducing the size of the Army? Are we talking about limiting Social Security benefits? Are we talking about eliminating programs for children or for people that need assistance? You know, we'd have to make some adjustments somewhere. Or are we talking about mandating a tax increase?
We went through the military part. We did decrease the military. And we began, because of that, calling up the National Guard. And so you may not be paying them the same dollars that you were paying them when they were not active. So you end up with a National Guard that's older. And the defense budget still goes back up again. And so you have to look at those pieces of the budget in terms of what percentage it makes up the budget. If you're in war, that defense budget is going to be a large budget. And it's going to be, as you said, even after the war is over, it's still going to be a large budget. And so I'm trying to figure out how these convention folk who are going to meet, whether it's for 2 months, a month, or whatever, going to be able to make these kinds of decisions that makes good decisions for people in America.
Well, they're not. They're just going to make a decision, which is balance the budget, and then they're going to expect the same Congress people that they apparently don't like now to go implement it. You know, they're going to say, you must balance the budget. What they don't know is they may be telling Congress, you must increase my taxes, or you must cut my benefits. I bet if you put it to them that way, they'd say, I don't know so much about this balanced budget. You know, there's a concept that some money is going to come due. There's a lot of U.S. dollars that'll never come due because they're not in our system. They're in the worldwide system. Those dollars have moved overseas. They're not coming back over here. They're part of that. You know, they're using those dollars much like some people would advocate the use of Bitcoin or something else. People have faith in the U.S. dollar, not that it has an inherent value that they can bring back to this country. And, for instance, you can't turn it in for gold anymore. But what they're betting on, what they're counting on, is the strength of the United States of America. And as soon as you, the strongest person in the world, start to handcuff yourself, you are sending a message to those people who believe in you. I don't know, maybe we should believe in somebody else.
Let's begin to unthread the quilt. And if you had grandparents or parents who knew how to quilt, and let's look at America. Can we unthread the world now who is billions or trillions of dollars invested in the American economy, who every day is part now of our stock market, that creates the additional tax dollars and other revenue that comes into this economy? I was in Germany, and I was in Paris, and I was laying on the bed watching CNN. I couldn't understand nothing they said until they started showing pictures in terms of where the economy was. And see, you may not speak the language, but you do understand the behavior. So how do we unthread that thread in the quilt so that we can now pull these folk out of our economy who we've asked them to come to be a part of a worldwide economy, who they've got trillions of dollars invested in corporations and trust funds and other kinds of benefits that Americans enjoy, and you decide one day you're going to have a balanced budget.
It's an economy based on us. It's an economy based on our leadership, our economic dominance in the world. It's our, you know, the fact that we are a big democracy and that we do stand for certain principles. And, you know, we stand for justice and freedom. And, you know, you prove yourself, if you're a business, you prove yourself in the marketplace. But are we going to undo that whole system? People have bought into it's called the American dream because it's us. Right. It's this country. And we're strong. And we've been strong. And we will be strong unless we start limiting ourselves. Unless we start saying, you know, maybe we shouldn't be that strong. Maybe we should cut back on strength. Maybe we shouldn't do as much weightlifting as we did. Maybe we shouldn't do that because We're going to cut back on how other people perceive us. Right now, people perceive us as strong, economically strong, morally strong, militarily strong. We got a strong dollar. People want our dollar. Are we really going to go and say, okay, that's not so good. Why don't we try something else? Let's quit being the United States of America. Let's be a second-tier country. Let's be a follower instead of a leader. Why don't we do that? Why don't we just go ahead and limit ourselves and say, you know, we've had a good run at this leadership thing. Why don't we term limit the country? Why don't we just term limit the United States and just say, you know, we've had our share of being the leader of the world. Oh, France, why don't you step up? And we're just going to all invest in euros. We're going to move the worldwide stock market really to Paris.
I don't think France and Germany would like that, or Sweden would like that very much when you start tampering with that. And I look at where we've come in the last 20-some-odd years since these wars begun, 20, 25 years. There is BMW who's coming here. There's Mercedes who's here.
Volvo.
There's Volvo who's here. There's Honda who's here. And I even look at airlines, especially Boeing that we have in Charleston. Is it Boeing American or is it Boeing foreign? Are they licensed all over the world to build planes? Or are we just one central location in terms of where they build? And so I want to be very careful in all of a sudden creating the balanced budget when in fact you have to spend some to get some. And if it requires you to do that, of course, given the behavior of Russia, I anticipate there'll be a lot other companies who either bring their headquarters here in America simply because they're not at war. You know, companies make money when the lights are on and water's flowing and people are buying and spending money. They're not making money over there right now in the middle of a war. McDonald's closed down 800 stores. Somebody else closed something big down not too long ago as well. But it's all about the return on my investment. If I'm going to get a return on my investment, I do want somebody who knows what they're doing. I have no faith in who's going to be selected to this convention. At least the person who run and get elected, especially in the Senate. Some 100,000 folk have taken a real good look at them. They became the leader of the pack. They got elected. A decision was made. Congress, 680,000, took a look at them and made the decision. A new number, 730. At least some real decisions got made. But here you're going to just find somebody, and they're going to represent me, not knowing very little or having very little experience. And I'm going to accept what they say when I've got to look at the investment, not just for me, but investment in America, investment for children to come through some group of folk who are going to go up there and tell Congress we want a balanced budget. It just doesn't make sense.
Well, it doesn't. And so if you're going to balance the budget, you're going to have to change up from what you're doing now, which means that people invest in us now because we have a quality workforce, we have a quality healthcare system, we have a quality education system. Those are all funded by dollars, some of which may be more than the actual amount we take in a given year. We have to cut back somewhere or either raise some more money. And the people that are asking for the convention don't seem to take any of that into account.
If you take a look at what other countries have done in creating a one-type healthcare system, are we ready for that? Everybody gets the same health care. Everybody pays the same costs. What does that do to doctors and nurses and others in the system? You don't charge an independent fee anymore. What does that do to that independent economy?
Well,
so you're talking about making major changes. You're $30 trillion in the hole.
That's one of many changes that could take place. We don't know if we would change how we, whatever, fund education, fund the healthcare system, fund the military, but you'd have to make some changes somewhere. You can't just go up and wave a wand and balance the budget. You've either got to make cuts or raise revenue. one or the other or a combination of the both of those.
Major policy changes.
Yeah, it would be major. It would absolutely. Because if it was easy, right? If it was easy, then they probably would do it now. The reason they're not doing it now is because we are in a pandemic. And from Charleston, did you know that? We are in a pandemic. And so we are we are facing challenges on the worldwide scene, and people are looking to us for leadership. When they said we need some more javelins and stingers, those are American-made weapons. Those are American-designed weapons. Those are U.S. weapons. That's what they want. They're not asking for other countries to send weapons. They're asking for us to send the weapons.
I'm told a story one time, and I won't be long with the story. The professor traveled all across the country, and he had a driver. And everywhere the professor went, the driver would listen to his speech, almost to the point that the driver could rehearse that speech and not miss one word in the speech. And the driver and the professor were having a conversation. They drove after several locations of speaking. The driver said to the professor, he said, "You know what? I can do exactly what you're doing." So the professor thought about that after he finished the next speech. He said, "I'm going to give my driver the opportunity to do it." So they came to the next location, and they switched hat. He put the chauffeur's clothes on, and the chauffeur put his clothes on. He spoke, did an elegant job. Well, when they got to the next location, they stopped. And at the end of the speech, somebody raised their hand. Senator Alexander raised his hand. You know, he was in the back of the room. He raised his hand. He said, "Sir, I have a question for you." And the gentleman began to ask the question. And he said, "Sir, that question's so easy, I can even ask my driver to answer that question." And so that reminds me, this convention, when we get there and they can't answer these questions, what are they going to say? Well, we can ask Congress to answer this question, although we made this decision to balance the budget that doesn't make good sense.
Well, exactly. So when they get to the convention, they talk about balancing a budget, and somebody says, "How are you going to do it?" Having not participated in the budget process themselves, they aren't going to have any idea.
I'm going to ask my chauffeur, he'll answer the question.
I'm going to ask people in Congress, the very ones that I'm mad at now, let's ask them how to do it.
Thank you so much.
Well, the Constitution was carefully crafted over many months, and I'm sure the process was actually thoughtfully thought out, maybe even over a longer period than that. And it's worked, not for just a decade or 2 decades. It's worked over centuries. It's worked during wartime. It's worked in peace. And now we're going to send a random group of people. We don't know how many. We don't know where they're going to come from. We don't know how many from which state. Don't know if one state's going to nominate those. One state's going to let the governor appoint those. One state's going to have an election. We don't know how these delegates are going to be selected, but through different processes, different numbers will show up. How many times have you shown up to, sometimes we go to these legislative meetings, or we go to, in your business, you might show up to a conference or convention where you hadn't met anybody. You don't know anybody. You really think you're going to be able to develop the relationships in a weekend or even a month to figure out how would you select the chair of the convention? You don't even know who's coming until they get there. And then until you get around and meet everybody and talk to them, assess them, determine whether they know what they're talking about, don't know what they're talking about, have an agenda, have a hidden agenda. You don't know who's going to be the chair of the convention, who's going to speak at the convention, what they're going to speak about. Are they going to follow Robert's Rules of Order? We don't know. We don't know what they're going to do. Are they going to require a majority vote? Or are they just going to say, well, if we get at least half a dozen of us to agree, we'll go with that? How do we know? We don't know. We don't know how they're going to be selected or where they're going to come from. But one thing's pretty much for sure. We know they won't be restricted, and we know that they will have a lot of people trying to influence them. They'll have people with deep pockets who have always eyed the Constitution as something's wrong with that, and now's my chance to fix it. This thing has been holding me back, and I want to make sure we change that. And so I'm going to make $1 million payment to every delegate to the convention. Nothing to stop them. They don't have to file ethics reports. They don't have to do any kind of reporting. There's nothing to prohibit the wild, wild west of the convention. So maybe that's the point. Maybe we should hold it in Las Vegas. I think that'd probably be the best place to hold it, is just go ahead and let's have it in the Wild West, because it's going to be the Wild West. It makes no sense to me. People that cherish their rights. I know that there are people in the media who cherish that right to a free press. And there are people that we know across this state and in this room who cherish their right to keep and bear arms. And there are people around the country who just totally value their right to speak their mind, say what they want to. But there are other people who've been looking at those same rights and going, no, I don't like those rights. I don't like these papers saying what they want to. I don't like people just speaking out when they want to. I don't like people walking around with guns. I think we should change that. I don't like the fact that everybody should vote. Maybe we should go back and change how we're going to allow people to vote. Maybe we're going to make them take a test before they can vote. Maybe we'll restrict them that they've got to own property or have a job. Maybe you've got to show your employment card to vote. There's a lot of changes that could be made to the Constitution that we've worked hard for over the years that we don't want to go back on. And there'll be no reason at all that if we send people to a constitutional convention that we're going to expect them to do what? I mean, I've just been trying to think how the whole convention was worked. Senator Scott, if you and I were two of the delegates that went up there, we knew each other, but we may not even know the other delegates from South Carolina, much less the delegates from North Carolina and Georgia. How long has it taken you to get to know, as new members have come into this body, been assigned to a committee that you are on, how long has it taken you to develop a relationship with them to know whether they knew what they were talking about, whether you could rely on their on the way that they did their research, whether they were going to be strong in their commitment when they said, let's push this through, or whether they're just going to kind of be with you but not with you. And we don't know if we got up there, let's say that South Carolina had 6 delegates, but only one of the delegates was voting for one thing and 5 were voting against it, but that one had teamed up with enough other people around the country that they were the majority, but the majority of South Carolina didn't want that. Could we leave? Could we walk out? Could we just say, no, we're not going to take that one back? Y'all recommended 7 amendments. Well, South Carolina really only voted for 2 of those, so we're only going to take 2 of them back home. We're not going to take the others back home. And in reality, I guess that's sort of how it would work, because it does have to come back to each body to do that. But we don't know how it'll work.
Senator from Orangeburg, Senator Stevens, what purpose do you rise?
The senior senator from Orangeburg yield for
If you quit calling me that, I will.
The senator yields for questions.
Thank you.
The senior senator yields for questions.
Senator, how long has the United States been working off of a continuing resolution, budget-wise?
Years. I'm not sure how long it's been, but maybe, at least 4 or 5, right? I'm not sure. Do you know? I don't know.
Many,
yes.
And Senator, as I sat and I listened to the conversation between you and the senator from Richland County, I was thinking, if the convention adopts the amendment for a balanced budget, if the Congress now can work off a continuing resolution over and over again, would they be able to waive that balanced budget criteria and just do whatever they want to do, as they have been doing thus far?
That's a very interesting question. What does balanced budget mean? Does it mean that at any one time, on any given day, we can't spend any more money than we take in? Or is it you have to balance your checkbook every month, or at the end of the year, or is it how much you allocate or how much you spend? What if you had a contingency reserve fund, and in the event of a pandemic, we're going to have this money set aside. In the event of a war, we're going to have this money set aside. But we really didn't spend it. We just had it there because we knew we might need it. Since we didn't use that, if we spent over in another area, is the budget still balanced? I mean, is it how, we might have allocated it one way, it got spent a different way. I'm always interested from time to time when I go to look at my checking account where it's off because I can't find a check that didn't get cashed 2 months ago. And they never, I paid a bill, paid it on time, but it didn't get cashed. So my checkbook is what? Out of balance, okay? But is it really out of balance? Because I've got it accounted for, but the money hadn't gone out yet. So when they say we're going to pass a balanced budget amendment, do you know how complicated in the scope of the federal budget it would be to articulate in words that you could put in a constitution what that means?
Quite complicated. And Senator, in 2012, I think, or 2012 or 2014, a group of economists played around with a balanced budget. And they said in their findings that the economy will spiral into a recession as well as long-term unemployment, all of those things that, inflation, all of those things that will drive this nation to its knees.
That does make absolute sense to me, because right now the economy is based on the knowledge that our federal government is going to do what it takes to remain in the most powerful country in the world. They know we're going to do what it takes, okay? If all of a sudden people are saying, well, the U.S. isn't going to be able to do that because they got this balanced budget amendment, they're not going to be able to do that. Either if they are going to do that, they're going to have to raise taxes, or they're going to have to close down this facet of government, or they're going to have to cut off health care to people or Social Security payments because, and so let's say it gets to month 11 and all of a sudden you've spent more money than you allocated because of just the way it got. Do you just don't pay out checks for until the next budget cycle comes because you just don't have it? Right now, what we do is we just borrow the money, we spend it when the next budget cycle comes, and I know we're going on continuing resolution now, which is less than optimal for many, many reasons. But the way you would normally do it is you'd catch it up in the next budget cycle. You would account for it. You'd make your cuts in the budget to account for it. But if you had an absolute balanced budget, it's like a drop-dead balanced budget, people who rely on that monthly deposit coming in for Social Security might all of a sudden miss 2 weeks because it's the end of the year. And we had to get that aircraft carrier out to sea. And so actually somebody's watching, it's probably have in Times Square like a digital count out of how much money is going out and how much money is coming in. And as soon as that thing turns red, they just shut off all the checks. Wait till it goes green again. Oh, and then your Social Security gets funded at least one more week. Oh, it went red again. You got to skip another week. Is that how it's going to work? We don't know.
And listening to your beautiful analysis, it led me to believe that with such, we will be a knee-jerk nation.
And
always responding without planning. And if you take the congressional side of trying to balance a budget, and you take the Noonies that you have sent to Congress because of term limits, the nation is not going to strive because of all of these this multiplicity of issues that have arisen from the Convention of States now, in a sense, tying the hands of those persons that you have elected to do a particular job.
So, Senator, in response to that, I would say you've heard many times us say that the United States is the leader of the free world. The United States is the strongest economy in the world. The United States is a leader in technology and a leader in manufacturing might and a leader in agriculture. Is there a problem with that? I mean, is there something wrong with that? Because it seems to me to say all of these things that we like being said about us, all of a sudden we're putting in jeopardy because we don't know what's going to happen. Again, I get back to my statement. We're just going to handcuff ourselves. We're just going to say, all right now, we know if we get in a pinch, Congress can move, the president, the executive, they can move, they can manipulate, they can take some money from here, pay that. They can borrow some money to do this. Yes, we owe that money back, but nobody's ever said we don't have the ability to pay it, because we do. But same people that are benefiting from those things, or we collectively are benefiting from the fact that we remain strong, nobody's willing to take that hit themselves. I mean, I haven't heard them say, oh, well, okay, I see these numbers sometimes. They say, well, if everybody had to pay back X amount of dollars, everybody had to pay back $10,000 or $20,000 or whatever it is. Well, nobody's willing to pay their 20, right? Or, I'm saying nobody, but a lot of people aren't willing to say, well, just stop my Social Security check till my 20 gets in there and then you can start it back. Or I won't go to the hospital for the next.
We don't have a lot of folks who are richer like you and the and the senator from Richmond who was over earlier, and some others. I'm just a little poor dirt farm boy.
Speaking of which, we ought to put a right to farm in the Constitution too. We ought to do something to protect the fact that we're an agricultural leader is really based on the fact that over time we have done a lot in the realm of agriculture, and we have lands set aside, but those lands are starting to get encroached on in many ways. And maybe that's something at some point that's so important that we should say, you know what, we ought to put in the Constitution that you could have an agricultural easement or a federal agricultural designation so that your lands would be in perpetuity set aside for agriculture. Because we can't continue to lose land and be a dominant factor in the agricultural world. So, I mean, there are a lot of things that we could change. There are a lot of things that could go in the Constitution. But when I hear those two words, balanced budget, what am I hearing? What are they really saying? I mean, we don't. We don't know whether that means that you have to balance it over 5 years, over 1 year, over a budget cycle. When is it balanced? And could we ever logistically go back and balance it right now? We could over time, but if we passed the balanced budget amendment and you had to all of a sudden start doing it tomorrow, I don't think there's any way that you could do it in one fell swoop and balance it. You'd have to set yourself on a glide path to do it over 20 years. Is that what they're talking about when they meet? Are they saying that within 20 years we'll be back to where we are taking in as much as we spend on a rolling 5-year average or an annual basis?
Considering I don't know what it is now, the conversation is about 10 years. And you're talking about a lot that can happen within those 10 years that will put that balanced budget off again, put that balance off again, and off again and again. So, Senator, thank you for the exchange, Senior Senator from Orangeburg, and thank you, Mr. President.
Well, this is just confounding to me that we don't know the answers to so many questions, and yet we are so ready to vote on something that we don't know what we're talking about. Of course, now, we've done that before. Don't get me wrong. We've done that before. But at least we've had a little bit more of an educated guess, some precedent of how it would work. In this case, we really have no precedent of how it would work. We don't know. And Senator from Richland, I know you know what balanced budget means, but do you think that every member of the convention who goes up there is going with the same idea, the same notion?
Senator from Richland,
That's
Senator
what I want
Scott,
to get up to.
what purpose do you rise?
Would the senator yield for a few questions, comments?
Senator yields for questions.
Senator, in reality, in terms of what we call a balanced budget, it really doesn't exist. We balance things at a point in time. Nowhere in the world can you have a balanced budget if you've got accounts that you continuously to spend out of. Budgets are only projections of what you anticipate you're going to spend. And so if you look at the real concept of budgeting, it is only for the purpose of having some type of control as it relates to your fiscal obligations that may come in. It does not mean that given how the American system is created, that at the end of the day, it's going to, when that date and time comes, it's balanced because I hadn't spent a dime over. If you look at your checking account, by the time you get your bank statement at the end of the month, you've already spent the money for next month. So your cash flow is never balanced. Maybe what you projected that you want to spend because you have fixed costs that you control, but your variables you can't. And so this notion that we're going to have a balanced budget. But then I went a little further than that.
Well, but let me just stop on that for 1 second, because I would venture to say that every member in here has in their purse or in their wallet or on their person a credit card, right?
Question.
And that's so they can, when they see something they need to spend money for, or they want to spend money for, they can spend it. Now, they might not actually have enough in their checking account to cover that, but they know they're going to get a paycheck by the end of the month, or they know that they're going to sell something and collect the money, or they know that they got somebody owes them some money and that note's coming due, and they'll have the money in time to pay it. Well, that's what we do now, but just because you've got money on a credit card doesn't mean that you're operating in the hole.
That is correct. And the question was from the senator for the other senator the junior senator from Orangeburg asked about a balanced budget. I became a little concerned about that question. Last time this country had what they considered to be a balanced budget, and it really wasn't a balanced budget because you had a surplus. 1996. It's been 20 years since we saw a balanced budget.
And so maybe it goes in cycles, and maybe in another 20 we'll be back in the surplus, but that doesn't mean that something won't happen. Because you remember, after 1996, not immediately after, but shortly after, the World Trade Center, 9/11, and we had to spend a lot of money. We had to send people overseas. We had to ratchet up the money that we were spending, and then along came other things that we had to follow up and do, or at least we felt like we had to go into Iraq, and then we had to, continue on with different spending obligations. And maybe those were wise decisions, and maybe they weren't. But the point is, we're not broke, okay? No. We may be out of balance in a cash flow situation, but the good faith and credit of this country is preeminent.
That's what it's all about.
Right.
And the other part, I took a step further. We only have had what was considered to be a balanced budget 4 times in 40 years. So I'm not sure what folk are looking for. I mentioned Boeing a few minutes ago, and not sure whether Boeing was what. Boeing is an American multi-international company. It's located in 65 different countries. So I know they don't operate with a balanced budget. 145,000 employees. It speaks all kinds of languages. Sell aircrafts, airplanes, spacecraft, you name it. If it flies, they mostly can produce it. And so corporations like that, multinational corporation, headquarters in a lot of different, Michael, Arthur, CEO of that large corporation. Just tremendous operation. And so you think they're going to look at us when they're looking at the rest of the world and says, listen, we're going to leave them because they got a balanced budget. Or we're going to come to them because they have a balanced budget. Corporates don't make decisions based on that. They make decisions based on us investing in them to come. And so if I got to become unbalanced to give them billions of dollars to come and I expect to get a tremendous return on my investment over the long period of time, am I not going to do it? Your home. Do you have a balanced budget when you bought your house? You have a 30-year obligation.
Everybody who owns a home and has a mortgage is out of balance, right? Because
nobody can't balance your budget.
They cannot pay it off right now. That's the whole idea of setting yourself up with a payment plan that you can meet over time. We don't make people, the only way you can buy a house is you can pay cash, right? We don't say that. If we said that, I mean,
Now, what good sense would it make to do that unless you plan to what we call in my industry, flip it?
Right. We don't even do that with cars.
Right.
I mean, there are very few things we say that you got to actually have. Smaller things, yeah, you got to go to Walmart, you got to pay, or you could put it on your credit card, but we don't finance the smallest of things. But the biggest investments that we have, a house in particular, and then in some cases car, we finance those. And that lets people leverage their good faith, their ability to pay over time. We don't make any one person go around and operate on a balanced budget themselves.
Because you take that money that you could pay for that house.
I wonder if these Constitutional Convention people are on a balanced budget. They got cash on the hip to pay for everything they want to, don't need a credit card, don't have a mortgage, don't need to borrow, aren't relying on government money coming in at the end of the month, or the beginning of the month, I should say. I bet many of them are. And they still want us to balance.
Did you know if they did have it on their hip, they're not going to spend it. They're going to hold on to that money, and if another opportunity comes that they can invest to make a return on that money, they're going to spend that money to make that return and then make that little monthly payment.
But one way of doing this would, you could say that if the national debt exceeded X amount, that Congress should then go back and get approval from the states to extend it beyond that amount and get some buy-in from the states that way. I mean, there are ways beyond just Congress you could put triggers in that would do this, but just using the words that we're going to pass an amendment 28 that says that thy budget shall be balanced. I mean, is it going to be that simple, or is it going to be?
I'm trying to figure out how you're going to achieve that with outstanding obligation.
Well, I was going to say, or is it going to be a 48-page amendment that says you've got to do this, but then in case of that, you can do this, but if you do this, you need to do that. I mean, because like you said, there may be times, there have been times, there are times in which we know we need to spend some money now that we will get back later, or what we need to spend it on is so important that we can't wait until later. What if we told Ukraine right now, oh yes, we'll send you a cargo ship full of javelins in 2026, because that's when the budget will allow us to actually get that ship out of port. That wouldn't work.
No, it would not. And if you look at where we are with a national budget, / obligations, we're at $7 trillion. So in order, even if you put the convention together, you got these folks go up and say, give us a balanced budget. The real question is how to pay off $30 trillion. That every second it's moving. And that's more than 4 times of our budget every year. And you really don't have what's called a yearly budget. You just have a yearly projection. And so how do we do that? If you want a balanced budget, where the first $30 trillion is going to come from? And that same year, you got 30 trillion plus another 7, so that's $37 trillion. And you got all these unfunded trust funds that you don't have enough money, that the trust fund produces enough money in order to be able to pay the bills. And so I'm trying to figure out, I guess when you do it all and come up, you're probably $50 trillion out. So how do you do this balanced budget deal.
Well, but even more important, how do the people that are going to the Constitutional Convention even know how to begin to talk in those terms to figure out what they're going to try and do? I mean, how is it even possible that that could happen?
Even some, and not to belittle or even try to make some of the folk who represent us appear that they don't know and understand what's going on. I attended a meeting one afternoon, and our delegation was in town, and then they began to talk about what was going on in Washington and began to talk a little bit about the budget and some of the behavior of it. Basically, as I sat there, I became so interested in looking at how this nation budget functioned, because they all said the same thing. I'm like, nowhere in the world, if you own separate committees and looking at different things, you should basically be saying the same thing, but just saying it in different ways. So I began to take that real dive into the national budget and take a really good forecast look at what's going on. And so I'll say this to you, if folk are looking to have a balanced budget, as the old song says, dream on. Dream on. Those days are gone. You can't have a balanced budget when in fact you are the mainstream that support the world's economy.
Well, that is, and I think that's the point that it gets missed over and over again. If we were some random country in the middle of the pack, then maybe you could do this. But when you're the leader of the world, when you have the strongest economy in the world, when you got the strongest military in the world, when you are the moral authority that many look to step up in terms of human rights and doing what's right and supporting democracy, you've got to be able to flex your muscle. You've got to be able to do what's right. You cannot be, limited by, if we did this tomorrow, we're going to violate the balanced budget. And let me ask you this. So what would happen if you did write that one check over the limit? Would it explode or what? I mean, what would
by the time it's cash, you could cover it.
Right. But the federal government sends out multiple payments and checks all the time. Right. So what if you held yours for 2 weeks because you didn't need to deposit it or you were on vacation, but all of a sudden they went in the hole while your check, which was good 2 weeks ago, now is not. You the one that gets stuck holding on to that?
I believe you have to call me, have to come get you, because Uber wouldn't even take your credit card. And so I hope that we are able to move beyond this point and begin to really understand how the global economy works. Because I think those who are asking for balanced budget need to understand if we've not been able to balance the budget but 4 times in 40 years in terms of outstanding in America, and in terms of where we were 40 years ago, made in America only, that doesn't exist anymore, that we now operate on a global economy, and we look every day in terms of what our value is compared to the ruble, the euro, and the pound, and everything else that's out there.
And every time you look at those measures, don't you come away saying, I'd rather be the U.S. than the other guy?
Well, if you go to an exchange, a currency exchange, what you paid yesterday may be different from what you pay tomorrow, because it's moving. And so we're in the best position we could be in as a country. And I just hope that people understand where we are as a country. Yes, you're going to have debt. If you invest in other countries, you got a couple of things. You can invest in other countries and go back to doing what we used to do 40 years ago. We just sent money to every country trying to take care and feed everybody rather than allowing them to participate in this global economy. But that's our challenge. Where do we want to stand in this country? Do people really understand what Russia's doing? Russia wants to get the Soviet Union back. Russia right now is at the weakest point it's ever been when you look at Ukraine in terms of what they need Ukraine for food. And I think
the wheat basket,
no question.
Yeah.
And so if they can get the other countries back up and get the Soviet Union back to where it would then be really a real strong country. But these other countries discover what democracy is all about. That's not going to happen again. That's why they joined NATO. And so Ukraine just tried to play the balance between the two because a lot of its wheat was going back into Russia. And so the others are going to learn major lessons from this. I said, give it a little bit more time. You're going to see Europe do something different. You've never seen it before. They're not going to sit there and just continue to beat upon.
Right. Well, Senator, I don't know if I know you've been to foreign countries before, and you get to the airport, or you maybe go to the bank and you go to draw out some dollars. But no matter where you are, you can either spend a dollar or get a dollar, okay? But you could go down to every bank that I can see out the window here, down there, and you could tell them you wanted to say, give me $100 in rubles. They don't have it.
They have that? No.
But if you in Russia at a bank and you said, give me $100, they got $100 in there. They could give you American dollars.
Or you can walk right down the street to an exchange, and they'd be happy to exchange American dollars. Everybody love American money.
And that's the point, is because the world's economy, in many respects, is built on the value of the dollar, the fact that our budget is not balanced is what makes that possible. It wouldn't be possible if we had to balance our budget and account for every dollar that was out there in the system
You
somewhere.
can't do it because you've invested in other countries who have different money exchanges. And so what the value was of your dollar yesterday, it could be up or down tomorrow. So there's nowhere in the world you could create a balance doing that.
That's
the economy.
There isn't. And so, and that's just we just talking about one amendment. The convention will be talking about the whole document. And they may be talking about, maybe we need to tighten up that freedom of religion thing, or maybe we may loosen up that freedom of the press thing, or maybe we need to get rid of that freedom to keep and bear arms thing, or maybe we need to change up that right to a jury trial, or maybe we need to, make a little change in that the way that we allow women to vote.
So you tell me all these cases that you've had to support those decisions that the court make, all of a sudden
throw them out the window.
They go out the window?
I mean, it's possible. It's possible that it just could be all over with.
That's unreal.
It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. And so, if we're going to have the Constitutional Convention, one of the things that I suggest we talk about is, what do we stand for? And to me, if we don't stand as a people to say that we're not going to tolerate hate crimes, that's as important a thing as I can think of. And so we've got to be able to do that. We have got to be able to know that if we send people to a constitutional convention,
how does it work?
How does it work? Who are
Makes
they?
decisions?
What are the limits? Absolutely.
What's the weight of the vote? Who's going to vote?
Well, weight of the vote. That's a good question. If California sends 40 and we send 10, everybody gets the same vote, or do we 10 have to vote and then we cast one vote and their 40 get together and they cast one vote and then we vote state against state, and if it's 26 to 25.
They vote by independent conventions then.
And look, what if something ends up winning by one vote? There's probably no chance in the world that would be confirmed by then 3/4 of the states. But
what about all these issues that you have been able to approve by a 2/3 vote? Now will a majority vote now override a 2/3 vote?
Well, let me tell you something about that. There was a case recently that was called Pinckney versus Peeler, and it dealt with the Heritage Act. And it dealt with the fact that we in the Heritage Act had set up a scheme that said you can't change something without a 2/3 vote. And it went to Supreme Court. Supreme Court says one legislature can't bind a future legislature. So does that mean that if we pass this Constitutional Convention and they don't call it before the elections in November, next January, that's a new General Assembly.
And a new convention.
Well, they were certainly not going to be bound by the fact that we voted for one this time. I mean, we might vote for one now, and it says in there, like, whereas we find that the federal government spending is out of control. Well, what if next year we actually find out that federal spending has actually come back into control? So one of the whereas clauses is changed. we can't, what we do now may be valid, would be valid, but it'd only be valid till January the 31st.
Well, I'm just concerned again, new administration, is that a new convention?
Well,
new Congress?
It's not.
New convention?
I'm not talking about a new administration. I'm talking about a new General Assembly.
Well, I'm talking about now in Congress, if you got these conventions, every time there's a change, every 2 years, there's a change. Every 4 years, there's a change. I mean, the two, of course, are going to add up to the 4. Am I looking to see some different folk who come in to run that convention, make those decisions? And then I'm really concerned even more about how much real knowledge they have of how the system actually works. If you were walking down the street and you had a conversation with someone, you began to talk about some of the things that we do in the legislature. Can they keep up with what you're talking about? I went to a meeting last night and began to talk about all the different things. I began to look at the faces in the room, very intelligent people. Then I began to ask myself the question, how much of it did they truly understand? That I do a job well enough that they were able to pick some pieces that made some sense to them? Or does it require even more time for me just to stay on one subject matter so they can understand that subject matter? The legislative process, and I've been in this thing now 14 years in here and 18 years across that hall, it is not an easy process. And if you can't understand the local aspect of it, you're not going to understand the federal portion of it and how all these things work together. Then you've got grants and other kinds of things that come to the local. It's an obligation. They have not expended it yet. You get recalls of funds coming back in. I'm just trying to figure out how you balance it.
Senator, I don't know how you'd balance it, and I don't know how you'd control it. I don't know how you'd define it. I don't know how if there an obstacle arose, how you'd get around it. I mean, the whole idea now is that Congress has flexibility with the budget process, whether it's a spending authorization bill, whether it's a continuing resolution, but they got flexibility to deal with whatever's happening at the time.
Right.
If you put yourself in a situation where you've already allocated all the money that you've got coming in, scheduled to come in for the year, and then somebody attacks you, or a hurricane hits, or a pandemic hits, and you all of a sudden need to expend emergency money, but you're out of it.
And so we made a mistake and we put it together. How to repeal it? And what's the time frame that I can repeal it? And how do I react to another war that occurred, additional virus that occurred, to stop myself from going into a recession? Because I moved to get a balanced budget, and the balanced budget process doesn't work. It slowed my economy down too much. I began to lose jobs by the hundreds of thousands. How do I get it back on track? Do I have to wait to call another convention?
Right.
I mean, just what? That's why Congress meet, to make those day-to-day decisions. It's ongoing.
Well, it really is. I mean, that's why I've said from the beginning, there's so many unknowns about what we're potentially voting on, what we're potentially asking a group of unknown people. Right now, we're saying we're going to put our faith in, I don't know how many delegates South Carolina's going to get, but let's say we get 10. There are 10 people sitting out there in South Carolina right now, or maybe not. Maybe then they're not. Maybe some of them are going to move in right before the convention, and we'll pick them, or some. We don't know who they're going to be, right? But these are 10 people that've never been necessarily. Some of them could be elected officials, I guess, but possibly never been elected to anything, and which means they have not stood before the people and gotten authorization to be a representative of the democracy, the democratic system. But we go pick these people. And maybe we would pick university professors or bankers or people with specific knowledge and send them, which is fine. But they haven't been vetted by anybody, which kind of got back to the point I asked you earlier. Will we at least have a screening committee to, if you wanted to be a delegate? Or would we just come up randomly and decide that, the Republican Party can pick?
I nominate Nikki Sessler. Let Nikki figure all that out.
Well, that's just it. I mean, maybe somebody would say, why don't we let the governor pick? Why don't we let the governor just pick 10 people? Or would we let the General Assembly elect them? We go to a joint assembly and put 10 names on the board and vote, say these are who the nominating committees come up with, and vote yes or no?
That wouldn't be fair to the governor to do that. That just would be unfair.
What it might not be is it might not be fair to the people to do that. I mean, don't you think that the people ought to have some say in who? Right now, they've got a say in the fact that you're sitting at that chair right there. They got a say in the fact that I'm standing right here. But when we get ready to go to a constitutional convention, we don't know who'd have a say, if anybody. And the ones that went, we don't know what. And we certainly don't know that they would vote the way you or I would vote.
So I go to a convention, I'm looking at major states like New York, who's just returning back to being normal again. Face masks coming down for children. Employment is going back up. The city, which is a major tourist state, is opening back up. Now look at South Carolina, we're a tourist state, but we do also manufacturing, import, export, growing manufacturing companies, some of the better schools in the country in terms of affordability and good educational system. Then I look at another state that doesn't need any of those things that we're talking about. So how do I make sure that my state get what it needs, New York continue to get healthy, California doesn't find itself in a situation worse than where New York was, with all these lives being lost at that time. But I have nobody to represent that. I sent it to a convention, they came up with a decision. You need a balanced budget, but all of those issues, healthcare issues, economic issues, employment issues, job growth, child care, children concerned, education system, those issues go out the window. So how do I make sure a state that large, what does it have, 12 million people in it, that these folk are safe, and I don't have to see folk all of a sudden moving to other states simply because we didn't address their issues in their state?
I don't know. And the point of me saying I don't know is none of us know. We don't know. We are, shooting blind here. We're saying, well, it sounds good, this balanced budget thing. We do it at South Carolina level. Why don't we? But nobody has stood up and said South Carolina is the leader of the free world. We're part of the 50
won't be the leader
states.
of the free world doing that.
No, not doing that.
I'm the leader of the convention.
We are able to balance our budget now by virtue of the fact that the federal government does not balance their budget. Because, and you serve on finance, our state budget is like 9 or 10 billion, but the amount of money flowing through is in the 20-something billion, right?
Almost 30.
30 billion. So that's federal dollars flowing through here, going to South Carolinians, going to help South Carolinians. All of a sudden, they got to balance the budget. They pull that 20 billion back, and we just got to operate the state on 10 billion. We couldn't do it.
Well, they're going to do it, especially with the federal funds that comes through.
Right.
Especially for the children, health care. I mean, how do you do it? But the budget is balanced. But guess what? It affected your household. You want a balanced budget as long as it didn't affect you. So now it's affecting you. So now you no longer want a balanced budget because your kids don't get free and reduced lunch. You don't get additional dollars to subsidize for housing rentals, also for other programs, weatherization, all these other major programs that are out there. And that's why if you look at how our budget is designed, the federal government has certain department, housing, urban development, the VA, and all these healthcare as it relates to making sure these programs actually work in these states. But you balance the budget. Which programs do you lose?
Well, we don't know. And the thing is, the people going to the convention aren't going to decide. The people in Congress would have to react to whatever the convention said and made a determination as to how to react. And so Congress would have to do the first reacting, and they got to do one or two things, right? Cut or raise. Because you're never going to bring it into balance right now. You couldn't borrow your way out of it. You'd have to cut or raise.
Add another component, or corporations leave.
Yeah, right. Or people do. People decide that hey, if the United States is not going to act like a leader, if they're not going to do what it takes when time comes.
These multi-international companies are gone.
Yep.
There you go. Thank you so much.
Senator from Lexington, Senator Sessler, what purpose?
Holding the floor, I would ask for a 5-minute recess.
5 minutes.
5-minute recess. Unanimous consent. 5-minute recess. Is there an objection? Here, no objection. 5-minute recess. Senate will come to order. Senator Martinsburg retains the floor.
Unanimous consent that we go to the Senator from Charleston, Senator Campbell's amendment. Carry over.
Move to carry over this amendment. You're asking to carry over this one and go to the Campson amendment. Is there objection? Hearing none, so ordered. Amendment. Reading clerk, please read amendment number 7.
Amendment number 7 is by Senator Campson. It amends a joint resolution on page 2, strikes line 5 through 6.
Senator from Charleston, Senator Campson. What purpose do you raise?
I'd like to explain the amendment.
You're recognized to explain.
Mr. President, this is a technical amendment that changes the language in the enacting clause to the language that we have, the enacting clause language we have in all of our bills and joint resolutions.
So the pending question is adoption of the amendment. Those in favor, please say aye. Opposed, no. Ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Senator from Orangeburg, Senator Hutto, what purpose do you raise?
To Amendment 1.
Unanimous consent to go back to amendment number 1. Reading clerk will read.
Amendment number 1, previously proposed by Senators Hutto and Sabb.
Senator
The
from
bill
Williams.
strike section 1.
Senator from Williamsburg.
I'd like to be heard on the amendment.
You're recognized on the amendment. Senator from Williamsburg.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. I really was looking forward to having a serious debate on this issue. I believe it's an issue of import. I think that a close examination of the legislation suggests that it's a bridge too far. And to not feel free to have that intellectual exchange, I think is a classic example of how we ought not do things. But I've agreed to not address all of the matters of concern in the interest of time. Years ago, when I served in the House of Representatives, I did not have a practice of watching the Senate debate. But for whatever reason, I found myself watching the debate where a young senator had a concern. And so the young senator took to the well or to the podium. And as I examined those comments, because it sort of came back to me as a part of this debate when we were talking about the American experiment of democracy and how it's an experiment. And then we likened it to the Constitution of the states and how it would, in effect, be an experiment. I thought about the comments of the young senator who felt that the Senate was engaging in an experiment because for the first time in its history, one individual would have what the senator classified as being too much power. And too much power concentrated in one place could have an adverse impact on this institution. And so when I looked at it, when I thought back on those remarks, I said to myself, I likened it to an experiment because it could have had a significant impact. And I say that because a lot of what we've talked about has been a discussion about power, authority, where it belongs and how it ought to be used and what kind of controls are there on it. And so here we are talking about the Constitution of the United States of America. The Constitution of the United States of America. The document that when I was in law school, Professor Winston Nagin and Professor Fletcher Baldwin traveled to various countries, touting our Constitution as a basis upon which they ought to build their own. That sacred document is what we're talking about altering. The document that allows us as Americans to declare our place in the world as members of the greatest nation on the planet. And we consider altering it in a very limited time. I submit there's something fundamentally wrong with that thought process, y'all. I don't know of a matter in my mind of greater import. And I know some of us suggest that it won't happen. That we are doing it, but we're doing it as a threat, and so something is going to happen in the not too distant future where what we do today will never come into its that the convention, I'll just say it that way, would not take place. I'm going to mention a couple of factual things and mention a couple of philosophical things, then I'm going to sit down. What's curious to me is that when you look at the states that this attempt is really being made in, those states, 34 of them, as what I'm looking at suggests, would have 31.28% of the population. 34 states agreeing to a constitutional convention could have less than a third of the people in the United States of America deciding that that's what they want to do. Less than a third. And then half of that less than a third can decide about the Convention of States. So you got 16% of Americans deciding what our Constitution ought to look like. If it doesn't happen, then it doesn't happen. But if it does happen, mathematically, in my mind, does it make sense? I'm indebted to Senator from Charleston, Senator Campson, who suffered, I mean that in a kind way, suffered my questions in order that at least some of what I wanted to talk about could be aired in these chambers, because as far as I'm concerned, time now no longer permits. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the feelings that are invoked with this process. In my church, we sing a song about bearing our burdens in the heat of the day, but that I know that the Lord will make a way. And so for a person like Ronnie Sabb, when we start talking constitutionally, that's where it takes me, y'all. It takes me back to the beginning, when every man wasn't considered a man constitutionally. And from whence we've come, and yet realizing that we've got a long way to go. As I stand here in these hallowed chambers, I am more convinced than ever that we are but a few laws away from going back to where we were. You think about it. What's happening in America right now with voting rights? They're being stripped. Voting is becoming more difficult. There's a movement in America to go backwards. Now, whether or not all of us want to admit that or not, is simply happening right under our noses. And so when you think about timing and the time to do this, in my humble opinion, it couldn't be worse. I think about voting, and then I think about the signal that South Carolina sends to the rest of the United States of America when we refuse to even debate the hate crime bill. I mean, we won't even allow it to come to the floor and have a conversation about it, and 48 other states have it in place. Why? What does the world think? Well, we don't care if hate crime happens in South Carolina. I mean, that's a natural conclusion that folks would reach. South Carolina is a significant state for a lot of reasons, not just because it's my home state. It's a significant state. The impact we can have on the United States of America, I submit, is a profound one. Our history gives us unique opportunities to show everybody who we are and whose we are. And I just think every time we miss out on those opportunities, we fall short of that which we have been empowered to do. Two points on the Convention of States, and I'm going to leave it alone. There's so much to talk about. So many real issues that I would hope that some would really take under consideration. My understanding is that there's an unwillingness to do that. I accept that from reliable sources whom I trust. And so the conclusion would be that it would be futile to engage. And so I'll, again, simply accept that. But as I listen to the scholarly conversation surrounding enforcement of what a delegate is or would be required to do, three things come to mind, and a couple was brought out in the scholarly conversation. One is the question as to whether or not, because persons are performing a federal duty, whether the state is allowed to criminalize that conduct. Mr. Chairman, Judiciary, I knew the answer to that question, but it is a significant legal question if the desire of the body is to have some teeth in the directives that's given to the individual. It's significant. But then the other question that I wonder about, I don't know the answer to it, is do the other states have similar enforcement laws? And if they don't, then they don't even have the opportunity to control that individual. I just wonder that from an academic standpoint. But I leave you with this, and there's nothing profound about it. But I just believe that the Senate that I've come to know, respect, and appreciate is worth preserving. And if we are to become a non-deliberative body, I think that this moment requires us to search ourselves and to ask ourselves the question, why did we come here? Knowing that it's a deliberative body, why do we come without patience? Necessary to give those of us who have legitimate points that we want to share with this body an opportunity to do that. I'm appreciative for the dinner conversations that I had last night with some of my colleagues. I know the deep love, I think, that many of us have for each other as individuals, each other's as senators. And I also firmly believe that if we allow the roots of the Senate to take hold, that we can preserve this body. I read somewhere where power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And when I say corrupt, I don't mean corrupt in an evil sense. I mean corrupt from the standpoint of a disregard for the minority party, which I liken to a disregard for those who are less fortunate. And so I think when folks are in a minority party, I think they're less fortunate. And so I would urge serious consideration what I believe is a significant moment in time. And I just leave with this note. If we can't debate changes to the Constitution of the United States of America, what can we debate? Thank you, Mr. President.
Pending question. Yes, the senator from Orangeburg.
Unanimous consent to pull down Amendment 1.
Unanimous consent to pull down Amendment number 1. Is there objection? Hearing none, so ordered. Clerk will publish next amendment.
Next amendment is Amendment number 6 by Senator Kempson. Amends the bill. It strikes Section 1 and inserts the following. Section 1, the General Assembly of South Carolina by this joint
Senator
resolution.
from Charleston, Senator Kempson, what purpose do you rise?
I'd like to be heard on the amendment.
You're recognized on your amendment. Senator from Charleston.
Thank you, Mr. President. That was very profound by the senator from Williamsburg. And when we look back on this moment in history, some history book, if we're true to what we do in this body, will be reflecting those words. Now, Senator from Williamsburg, I'm going to depart a bit from this moment of reflection and talk about an amendment that I know won't be taken seriously by this body, but I'm going to be encouraging. If the door is open for a constitutional convention, I'm going to be encouraging the delegates of South Carolina to go rogue. I want them to go rogue because as I read the amendment, it is broad, very broad. And we've discussed how broad the language is. And so because it's so broad, I am going to be calling for our South Carolina delegates to add a conversation to this constitutional convention. And the language that I want to add is I want the convention to discuss providing for reparations to account for the racial discrimination rooted in colonialism and slavery to remedy entrenched economic, social, and political inequities along racial lines. That's what reparations are. As we discussed in this body, this Constitution was ratified in 1788 and went into effect in 1789. Many of the authors owned slaves. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Franklin. And so if you would think with me for a moment, and remember that it was in the year 1619 when the first Africans arrived on the shores of this nation. 1619. About 40% of them arrived right here in Charleston, South Carolina, Gadsden's Wharf. Gadsden's Wharf will be the home of the International African American Museum. And for approximately 244 years, our ancestors lived amidst of a system called physical slavery. And for all of those years, we were things to be used and not people to be respected. Our greatest resource was our ability to pick that cotton, fetch that water, and chop that wood. We were things to be used. And even after 244 years, there was another 100 years of racial segregation. And so we were facing a new type of psychological oppression, racial segregation. And so for 344 years, we met political domination, economic exploitation, segregation, and humiliation. So we understood that the Emancipation Proclamation occurred in 1863. And we had now documents on paper that set us free. And then we had the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. But injustice and equality do not just disappear because they're written on paper or because somebody says it. And so, because of the generational legacy of 100 years or hundreds of years of brutal slavery and all that came with it, the lynching, the hostility, control, disenfranchisement, I am calling for this constitutional convention, if it takes place, to discuss reparations. The term reparations is defined by the making of amends for wrong one has done by paying money or otherwise helping those who have been wronged. To be clear, in my view, I'm not talking about 40 acres and a mule, although I'm not dismissing the idea that has been discussed for decades. But if we are going to have a constitutional convention, I would like to see reparations in the form of fully funding schools all across America, including the corridor of shame. Right here in South Carolina, there are 36 plaintiff school districts with 86% poverty rate, composed of 80% minority students. These schools are where water fountains don't work, raw sewage back up into the hallways, and libraries, we still have libraries with books that one day a man will make it to them. That's shameful. Shameful. If I am, or if we have a constitutional convention, I would like to see reparations in the form of consistent financial support from Congress to fund historically black colleges like South Carolina State University. Year after year, historically black college presidents have to go to Washington, D.C. and beg for resources to meet the payroll, to upgrade dormitories, some of which are 50 years old. This is unacceptable and shameful. If we have a constitutional convention, I would like to see reparation in the form of secured bank loans to small businesses located in distressed areas whose owners and employees live in the affected neighborhoods. I want to see equity in the federal and state procurement process, whereby the number of small and minority-owned businesses that get contracts reflects some measure of this nation's minority population. I am not interested in opening a conversation about this Constitution without addressing that the very effect that this document had on the people that it was designed to oppress. So I can't understand why we would have a Constitution and not address the issues that I've talked about. And as we stated earlier, I'm going to be advocating that our delegates go rogue, because as I mentioned previously, 40% of the Africans who arrived on the shores of this nation came right here through Charleston, South Carolina, and we are still witnessing the lingering effects of Jim Crow and racial segregation. And quite frankly, I don't know how we get to a constitutional convention and not discuss these issues. In fact, just last year, Congress brought forth House Bill 40, which is contemplating designing a commission to discuss reconciliation and reparations. And we have done this before. There are examples after examples after examples, and I have them all here, where the government has put money in a fund to address the horrors of a government-backed system. We did it for the Japanese Americans when they were interned. We did it time and time again for the Native Americans. And so just because this is complex does not mean it can't be done. In fact, when in the aftermath of 9/11. The government supported the 911 Victims Compensation Fund. We engaged a special master to determine who died and how much that family deserved. And so this has been done before, and just because it's complex doesn't mean it can't be done. In closing, addressing these evils requires hard work and a dogmatic and unrelenting desire to bring about an end. Otherwise, until this issue is addressed, it will continue to eat at the core and the very freedom that we are all promised. So I'm going to vote against the Constitution, no convention. But I can tell you, I will be advocating to the delegates that we send that they stand strongly for addressing the unrecompensed labor of free African slaves in the form of addressing the areas that I've outlined today. Move for adoption. Move for adoption.
Pending question is the adoption of the amendment. Senator from Edgefield, what purpose do you rise?
Mr. President, I move to table the amendment.
Motion is to table the amendment. Those in favor would say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Ayes have it. Amendment is tabled. There are no further amendments. Pending question is second reading of the bill. Roll call is required. The clerk will ring the bell. Senator from Clarendon, what purpose do you rise?
I have unanimous consent request.
State your request.
Leave for the senator from Greenville, Senator Allen.
Without objection, leave for the senator from Greenville, Senator Allen. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adams? Aye. Mr. Alexander? Aye. Mr. Allen has leave. Mr. Bennett? Aye. Mr. Campson? Aye. Mr. Cash? Aye. Mr. Clymer? Aye. Mr. Corbin? Mr. Corbin votes no. Mr. Cromer? Aye. Mr. Davis? Aye. Mr. Fanning? Aye. Mr. Gambrell? Aye. Mr. Garrett? Aye. Mr. Goldfinch? Aye. Mr. Grooms? Aye. Mrs. Gustafson? Aye. Mr. Harpootlian? No. Mr. Hembry? Not voting. Mr. Hutto? No. Mr. Jackson? No. Mr. Kevin Johnson? No. Mr. Michael Johnson? Aye. Mr. Kimbrell? Aye. Mr. Kempson? No. Mr. Loftus? No. Mr. Malloy? Not voting. Mr. Martin has leave. Mr. Massey? Aye. Mrs. Matthews has leave. Mr. McElveen? No. Mr. McLeod? No. Mr. Pillar? Aye. Mr. Rankin? Aye. Mr. Rice? Aye. Mr. Sabb? No. Mr. Scott? No. Mrs. Sin? Aye. Mr. Setzler? Not voting. Mrs. Shealy? Aye. Mr. Stevens? No. Mr. Talley? Aye. Mr. Turner? Aye. Mr. Verdon? Aye. Mr. Williams? No. Mr. Young? Mr. Young votes aye.
Have all members voted? Senator from Edgefield, Senator Massey. Senator leave for the senator from Darlington. Without objection. Senator Hembry votes aye. Other members needing to cast their vote? Hearing none, the polls will close and the clerk will tabulate. By a vote of 27 to 13, the bill receives a second reading. Senator from Edgefield, what purpose do you rise?
Mr. President, I want to see if there are any unanimous consent requests.
Senator from Clarendon.
Thank you, Mr.
Recognized.
President. I do have unanimous consent requests. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to have the profound words spoken by the senator from Williamsburg County, Senator Sabb, recorded in the journal.
Without objection. Senator from Cherokee.
Unanimous consent request.
State your request.
I have a time-sensitive bill on page 27, top of the page, House Bill 4269, dealing with a precinct matter in Union County only. And I ask unanimous consent to give that bill second reading today and third reading tomorrow. That'd be House Bill 4269, page 27.
House Bill 4269 on page 27. Unanimous consent to go to that bill, give it a second reading,